Imagine a spring that never dries out. Not a rainy week, not a soggy month, but rain falling week after week after week until the very ground beneath your feet turns into something between soil and soup. Now imagine that this isn't happening to one unlucky village. It's happening across an entire continent at once. From the coasts of England to the plains of Poland, the sky simply refuses to clear. That's not the opening of some apocalyptic myth. That's actually what happened in the year 1315. And here's the unsettling part. Nobody living through it had any way of knowing when or if it would ever stop. We tend to think of famines as slow, predictable things. Bad soil, a failed crop, maybe a war disrupting trade. But what happened starting in 1315 wasn't caused by any of that. It was caused by water, too much of it, falling from the sky at exactly the wrong moments for years in a row. And what makes this story so strange is that it didn't stay a weather problem. It became something much bigger, much darker, and much more human. Because when the rains kept falling and the wheat kept rotting in the fields, something had to give. Grain prices didn't just rise, they exploded, sometimes tripling or quadrupling within months. People who had never gone hungry in their lives suddenly found themselves boiling weeds for dinner. Livestock, weakened by the same relentless wet and cold, began dying by the thousands, which meant even less food and even less strength to plant whatever might come next. Bodies already thin from hunger became easy targets for disease. Trust between neighbours, between towns, even between lords and the people who depended on them, started to fracture under the pressure of empty stomachs. This is the real question we're chasing in this story. How does a bad growing season, something farmers had dealt with for centuries, turn into what historians now call the Great Famine, one of the deadliest disasters in medieval European history? How does rain of all things manage to touch nearly every layer of society, from the poorest peasants scraping frozen mud out of a field, to kings trying to figure out how to feed cities that were quite literally starving in front of them? Because that's exactly what happened. Weather turned against Europe, and then Europe, in a way, turned against itself. Communities that once shared what little they had began hoarding it. Desperation crept into places where order used to hold. And underneath it all was this quiet, terrifying realization, spreading from village to village. This wasn't a bad year. This was something else entirely. Over the next several minutes, we're going to walk through exactly how that happened. Not just the science of the climate shift that triggered it, but what it actually felt like to live through it. What people ate when there was nothing left to eat. How cities that had money but no food learned a brutal lesson. How the church tried to make sense of a disaster that seemed almost biblical in scale. And how, eventually, after years of suffering, the rain finally stopped. But before we go back to those soaked fields of 1315, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? And what time is it there? I love seeing these comments roll in. It's midnight in Lisbon. It's early morning in Toronto. It's someone's lunch break in Sydney. It's honestly one of my favourite parts of making these. And if you enjoy this kind of deep dive into history, the best way to support the channel is by following the show on Spotify. Listen there if you can, and if you're enjoying what you hear, a 5-star review genuinely helps more than you'd think. The link is right down in the description. Now, let's get back to 1315, when the sky simply would not let up. To understand why the rain that started falling in 1315 turned into a catastrophe instead of just a bad year, you have to go back a little further. You have to understand what Europe looked like right before the Deluge. Because the truth is, this continent was not some struggling backwater teetering on the edge of disaster. Quite the opposite. Europe in the decades before 1315 was, by medieval standards, thriving. For roughly 3 centuries, from around the year 1000 onward, Europe had been experiencing something historians now call a medieval warm period, or at least a stretch of unusually favourable climate. Winters were milder, growing seasons were longer, harvests, more often than not, came in reliably enough to feed the people who depended on them. And people responded to that stability the way populations almost always do. When food becomes more available, they multiplied. Estimates vary, and honestly, trying to count medieval populations is closer to educated guesswork than hard science. But most historians think Europe's population somewhere between 1000 and 1300 may have doubled, maybe even tripled in some regions. Villages that had housed a few dozen families grew into hundreds. Market towns swelled. Cities like Paris, London, Ghent, and Florence became genuinely urban in a way that would have seemed unimaginable to earlier generations. More mouths to feed meant more land needed to be farmed, and Europe answered that demand with astonishing energy. Forests were cleared, wetlands were drained, hillsides that had never seen a plough were suddenly covered in furrows. This wasn't gentle expansion either. This was Europe pushing agriculture into places it had never gone before. Marginal lands, thin soils, steep slopes, low-lying ground that flooded easily in a wet year. Under good conditions, some of this marginal land could produce a decent crop. But it was never resilient land. It didn't have the deep, well-drained soil of the best farming regions. It depended on the weather cooperating year after year, without much room for error. And that's really the heart of the vulnerability that was quietly building beneath all this apparent prosperity. Europe's population growth had outpaced the quality of the land available to support it. More people were now depending on food grown in places that were only marginally suitable for farming in the first place. It's a bit like building a city's water supply around a river that's been unusually full for decades, then acting surprised when a single dry year suddenly isn't enough. Grain sat at the absolute centre of this entire system. Wheat, rye, barley, oats. These weren't just dietary staples, they were essentially the currency of survival. Bread made up somewhere around 70 to 80% of the calories in a typical peasant's diet, depending on region and season. Beer and ale, brewed mostly from barley and oats, provided a meaningful chunk of daily calories too, which sounds almost comical until you remember that clean water wasn't always reliable, and fermented drinks carried real nutritional weight in medieval life. So when we talk about grain harvests in this period, we're not talking about one crop among many. We're talking about the thing that quite literally kept people alive. And here's where the fragility really starts to show. Medieval Europe had almost no meaningful food reserves. There was no elaborate storage infrastructure, no strategic grain stockpiles sitting in reserve for a bad year, at least not on any scale that could absorb a true crisis. Most households, most villages, most towns operated on a kind of rolling margin. This year's harvest fed this year's population, with maybe a little surplus set aside if things had gone well, but rarely more than that. Storage technology itself worked against them too. Grain kept in damp conditions rotted or sprouted. Vermin got into stores. Without modern preservation methods, holding on to large surpluses for multiple years wasn't just difficult, it was often physically impossible. This meant the entire system was balanced on an assumption that most people probably never even thought to question. The assumption that next year's harvest would come in roughly on time, roughly on schedule, roughly as expected. One bad harvest medieval Europe could handle. People had been doing that for generations. Prices would rise for a season, households would tighten their belts, some communities would suffer more than others, and then the next harvest would arrive and things would settle back down. This was the normal rhythm of medieval life. Scarcity wasn't some unthinkable horror. It was a familiar visitor, but 2 bad harvests in a row. 3, 4. That was an entirely different scenario, one the system had almost no capacity to absorb. Because, remember, transport in this era was slow, difficult, and expensive. There was no dense network of roads capable of moving huge quantities of grain quickly across long distances. Rivers helped where they existed and where they were navigable, but overland transport of bulk grain by cart was slow, costly, and limited by terrain, weather, and the availability of draft animals, which, ironically, also needed to be fed. Moving surplus grain from a region that had it to a region that didn't wasn't some simple logistical fix. It was an enormous undertaking, and even when it worked, it often wasn't fast enough or large enough to fully offset a serious regional shortfall. So what you had heading into the year 1315 was a continent that had grown remarkably successful at feeding itself under normal conditions, but had almost no buffer built in for abnormal ones. Population had expanded to fill the available land, including plenty of land that was only marginally productive. Food reserves were thin by design, not by accident, because the system simply wasn't built to store large surpluses for long, and the infrastructure needed to move food from areas of abundance to areas of shortage was nowhere near capable of handling a continent-wide crisis. People living through this period weren't naive about scarcity. They knew what a bad year felt like. They knew how to tighten their diets, how to stretch grain further, how to wait out a rough season until the next harvest arrived. What they had never really experienced, at least not within living memory for most of them, was a disaster that simply refused to end on schedule. A failure that didn't correct itself after one difficult year, but kept compounding season after season, with no clear end in sight. That's the Europe standing right on the edge of 1315. Prosperous in its own medieval way, densely populated by the standards of the age, dependent almost entirely on grain harvests that had to succeed nearly every single year to keep the whole fragile system running. And utterly, completely unprepared for what was about to fall from the sky, not for a week, not for a season, but for years. And that raises the obvious question, why did the weather stop cooperating? The answer is not as simple as saying Europe suddenly entered an ice age. It didn't. Nobody woke up in 1315 to frozen rivers in July and glaciers marching through the streets of Paris. The Great Famine was caused by rain, not by some instant collapse into polar conditions. But that rain fell during a much bigger environmental transition, one that had been unfolding quietly for generations. For centuries, Europe had benefited from what historians and climate scientists often call the medieval climate anomaly. The name makes it sound like every year between 1000 and 1300 was warm, dry, and perfect for farming. It wasn't. Medieval weather was still medieval weather. Storms came, rivers flooded, harvests failed, winters could be brutal. But across much of the North Atlantic world, the broad pattern seems to have favoured conditions that were relatively mild, at least compared with what came later. That mattered enormously. A slightly longer growing season can mean grain has enough time to ripen before autumn. A slightly milder winter can mean fewer animals die in their stalls. A little less persistent rain can mean fields drain. Seed goes into the ground on time, and carts can actually reach market. None of these changes sound dramatic on their own. But over decades they create the conditions for population growth, agricultural expansion, and the feeling that the world is becoming more reliable. Then, somewhere around the late 13th and early 14th centuries, that pattern began to shift. The climate across northern Europe appears to have become cooler, wetter, and more unstable. Not everywhere in exactly the same way, not in a neat line from one year to the next. Climate doesn't work like a switch being flipped. You don't get a messenger riding across Europe announcing that the good weather is over and the little ice age has begun. What people experienced instead was a series of difficult years. Wetter seasons, colder spells, harvests that seemed less dependable. Winters that lingered. Summers that did not always deliver what farmers needed. This broader period is often connected with the beginning of the Little Ice Age, a long era of generally cooler conditions that affected parts of the Northern Hemisphere for centuries. But even that phrase needs to be handled carefully. The Little Ice Age was not one single event. It was not a single year, a single storm, or even one universally agreed date on a calendar. It was a complex period with regional differences, warmer intervals, colder intervals, and weather extremes, layered on top of slow changes in average conditions. Think of it less like Europe being placed inside a freezer, and more like the rules of the game getting worse. For a farming society already operating close to the limit, a small shift in the average climate could have enormous consequences. If summers become only a little cooler, grain matures more slowly. If rainfall becomes more frequent or more persistent, soil stays saturated. If winters become longer, the gap between stored food running out and the next harvest getting underway becomes more dangerous. A society with large reserves, global trade, modern drainage, and crop insurance might absorb those changes. 14th century Europe had none of that. And there's another important detail. Cooler doesn't necessarily mean drier. In fact, a colder North Atlantic climate could still produce precisely the kind of wet, miserable conditions that devastated Europe in 1315. The real danger was not simply temperature. It was the combination. Cold, wet springs delayed planting, wet summers ruined grain in the field, damp harvests spoiled in storage. Muddy roads made transport harder. Flooded meadows reduced hay production, which weakened livestock through the winter. Every part of the agricultural system was connected to every other part, and prolonged rain could damage all of them at once. But here's where we have to slow down, because medieval climate history comes with a frustrating limitation. We do not have weather stations from 1315, no thermometer readings from Yorkshire, no rainfall gauge sitting outside a monastery in Flanders, no satellite images showing storm tracks across the Atlantic. What we have are clues. Tree rings can tell us about growing conditions in particular years. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica can preserve evidence of volcanic eruptions that affected the atmosphere. Lake sediments, pollen records, glacier advances, written chronicles, harvest accounts, manorial records, even reports of rivers freezing or vineyards failing, all offer pieces of the puzzle. But they are pieces. They do not give us a perfect medieval weather map. So, when historians say the climate was changing, what they really mean is that multiple lines of evidence point toward a broad shift. The weather patterns that had helped support Europe's expansion were becoming less favourable. And by the early 1300s, communities across northern Europe were beginning to feel the consequences. Why that shift happened is still debated. One possible factor was the Atlantic Ocean itself. Europe sits downwind of the North Atlantic, and its weather is shaped by an enormous system of ocean currents and atmospheric circulation. Warm water moving northward helps moderate European temperatures. Shifts in sea surface temperatures, sea ice, winds, or the path of Atlantic storms can change where rain falls and how long wet weather lingers. Scientists sometimes discuss changes in the North Atlantic Oscillation, a large-scale pressure pattern that influences winter storms across Europe. In one phase, storm tracks may bring milder, wetter conditions to some regions. In another, they may shift elsewhere, but reconstructing the exact state of this system in 1315 is extremely difficult. We can say that North Atlantic circulation likely mattered. We cannot confidently point to one particular current or pressure system and declare, This is the thing that caused the famine. Volcanoes may have played a role too. A major volcanic eruption can throw sulfur-rich particles high into the atmosphere, where they reflect sunlight back into space. The result can be a short-term cooling effect, sometimes lasting a few years. Ice core records show that the late 13th and early 14th centuries included significant volcanic activity, and some researchers have argued that this may have helped push the climate toward cooler conditions. But again, the word is may. Volcanic forcing could have nudged an already unstable climate in a colder direction. It could have shortened growing seasons, altered atmospheric circulation, or made certain years more difficult. But volcanoes alone do not explain the whole disaster. The Great Famine was not caused by one eruption in the way a city can be buried by one blast. It emerged from an interaction between long-term climate trends, short-term weather, fragile agriculture, population pressure, and plain bad luck. Because natural variability matters too, even in a stable climate, weather can produce catastrophic years. A sequence of stubborn storm tracks, unusually cool summers, or repeated wet seasons can happen without requiring one grand planetary cause. The atmosphere is chaotic, oceans shift, winds change. A slight alteration in where storms form can mean the difference between a manageable summer and a season of rain that never seems to end. And that may be the most unsettling part of this story. Europe did not need some apocalyptic transformation of the planet to be brought to its knees. It only needed the weather to remain bad for longer than its food system could endure. By 1315, the continent was already living in a world that may have been turning less forgiving. The warm, relatively favourable centuries were fading. Marginal fields that had produced enough grain in a mild run of years were becoming more risky. Harvests had less room to recover from setbacks, and the people who depended on those harvests had no way of knowing whether the difficult weather they had noticed was temporary or the beginning of something much larger. Then spring arrived, and with it came rain. At first it may not have seemed like the beginning of a continental catastrophe. It rained, that was all. Rain in spring was normal. Farmers needed rain. Winter wheat needed moisture. Pastures needed moisture. Streams needed to refill after winter. Nobody in April of 1315 could look at a grey sky and know that the next several years would be remembered as one of the worst food crises medieval Europe had ever seen. But this was not the kind of rain farmers hoped for. It came too often, it came too heavily, and most importantly, it did not seem to leave. Across northern Europe, chroniclers began recording a season of persistent wet weather. Their accounts were local, because that was how medieval people experienced the world. A monk in England wrote about rain and flooded ground near his monastery. A town clerk in the Low Countries described roads turned to mud and fields under water. Writers in parts of France and the German lands remembered storms, cold and crops struggling to grow. No single chronicle can tell us exactly what happened everywhere. Medieval writers were not meteorologists. They did not measure rainfall in millimeters or map pressure systems over the Atlantic. They wrote what seemed extraordinary to them, rivers swollen beyond their banks, rain continuing through the season, crops failing, hunger spreading, and sometimes chroniclers exaggerated. They wrote with religious purposes, moral lessons, political loyalties, and a natural desire to make terrible events sound as terrible as they felt. When someone says it rained without interruption, we should not imagine every hour of every day was a downpour. But when reports from widely separated regions begin describing the same basic conditions, the pattern becomes hard to ignore. England, northern France, Flanders, the Low Countries, parts of the Holy Roman Empire, areas around the North Sea and Baltic, different languages, different rulers, different local economies, the same complaint: too much water, And this mattered because spring was not an empty space between winter and harvest. It was the moment when the agricultural year either got moving or began falling apart. Picture a medieval farmer looking at a field after weeks of rain. The soil is saturated, water stands in low places, every step sinks into mud. A plough pulled by oxen or horses cannot cut cleanly through ground that has become a heavy, sticky mess. The animals struggle for footing, the ploughshare clogs. The furrows collapse back into wet earth. Modern farming can sometimes work around bad weather. Tractors can cover huge areas quickly when conditions improve. Drainage systems can remove water from fields. Seeds can be bought, machinery repaired, fertilizer applied, loans taken out, grain imported from another continent. A 14th century farmer had almost none of those options. If the weather gave you a narrow window to plough and sow, you used it. If that window closed under rain and mud, you waited. And while you waited, the calendar kept moving. That was the trap. Medieval agriculture ran on timing. Not perfect timing, perhaps, but close enough. Spring grains such as barley and oats had to be planted early enough to establish themselves, grow through the summer, and ripen before autumn weather turned cold and wet again. Garden crops had their own schedules, hay had to be cut and dried. Livestock needed pasture. Labour had to be divided between a lord's demesne. The land worked directly for the estate, and the strips cultivated by peasant families for their own survival. One delay could create another. If ploughing began late, sowing began late. If sowing began late, the grain emerged late. If grain emerged late, it flowered and ripened later, pushing harvest toward the damp, shortening days of autumn. And if the harvest came late, there was less time to cut, bind, carry, thresh, dry, and store it before more rain arrived. A wet spring did not guarantee famine. Europe had survived wet springs before. But in 1315, the rain was arriving in a society with very little slack. Many families had already eaten much of what they had stored from the previous harvest. By spring, food supplies were often low even in ordinary years. This was the hungry season, the difficult stretch before new crops could replenish the household. Seed grain had to be protected because eating it meant sacrificing the future. But hungry people facing an empty pot do not experience seed as an agricultural investment. They experience it as food sitting within reach, and the rain made the future less certain with every passing week. For peasants, this was not yet necessarily a crisis of price or trade. The market had not become the main story. The disaster began much closer to home in the field itself. A farmer did not need to hear that grain prices were rising in London, Bruges, or Paris to understand that something was wrong. He could see it in the water lying between the furrows. She could see it in the seeds still waiting in a sack because the land could not be worked. Families could watch the weeks pass while the village's shared fields remained brown, soaked and unplanted. The anxiety would have been intensely practical. Can we get the oxen into the field tomorrow? Will the rain stop by Sunday? Have we planted enough? Is there still time? Those questions became more urgent, because medieval fields were not all the same. Some were on better drained slopes, some sat in heavy clay soils that held water. Some lay near rivers and meadows vulnerable to flooding. A village with relatively sandy ground might manage to sow part of its acreage. Another, only a few miles away, might find its fields nearly unusable. That local variation is important. The Great Famine did not strike every farm with identical force on the same day. Some districts suffered earlier, others suffered worse. Some households had reserves, livestock, access to woodland food, or relatives in less damaged areas. Others had nothing except a tiny plot, a few animals and a harvest that depended completely on the weather. But local differences did not prevent a larger disaster. They helped hide it at first. A village might assume it had simply endured a bad season. A monastery might record flooded meadows as a local misfortune. A town might complain that carts could not reach its gates. Yet beyond the horizon, hundreds of other communities were confronting their own version of the same problem. That is how a regional weather event became a continental threat. Normally, one area with a poor harvest could seek grain from another area with a better one. A town could buy from the countryside. A lord could draw on rents from estates elsewhere. Merchants could move supplies along rivers, roads, and sea routes. The medieval economy was limited compared with the modern world, but it was not isolated. Grain moved, information moved, credit moved, but widespread rain attacked the system before the grain even existed to move. It soaked fields across multiple producing regions. It slowed transport as roads became deep mud and rivers flooded. It reduced haymaking and threatened the feed needed for animals. It delayed planting over an area so broad that the usual safety valve importing from a neighbour began to fail. The trouble was no longer that one village had been unlucky. The trouble was that too many villages were unlucky at once, and the season was still young. That was perhaps the cruelest part. In spring 1315, there was no final proof yet that the harvest would fail. Grain could still be planted late. Summer sunshine could still rescue a damaged crop. The weather could change. People had to hope it would, because there was nothing else to do. So they waited for the ground to dry. They watched the clouds. They pushed ploughs into fields whenever the rain eased. And all across northern Europe, the agricultural calendar slipped further out of their hands. The famine had not yet appeared in the markets. Not fully. Bread had not yet become the central terror. The great price rises, the hunger, the sickness, and the desperate search for food were still ahead. But the chain had already begun. It began with rain falling on seed that could not be sown. And even where the seed did make it into the ground, the rain was not finished with it. Planting late was only the first problem. Grain does not simply need water. It needs the right amount of water at the right time, followed by enough warmth and sunlight to grow, flower, fill its kernels, and ripen. In 1315, across much of northern Europe, that sequence began breaking down. Fields stayed cold, soil stayed saturated, young plants struggled to establish deep roots because the ground held more water than air. In the lowest fields, water could drown seedlings outright. In heavier soils, especially the clays common in parts of England, northern France, and the Low Countries, the earth turned dense and airless. A crop might emerge thinly, yellow at the tips, scattered across a field where a farmer expected a thick green cover. And then came the deeper problem. The grain that did survive had fallen behind. Think about what that meant. A farmer is not harvesting a single plant. He is trying to bring in an entire landscape of ripening grain during a limited stretch of dry weather. The stalks have to mature, the heads have to fill. Then labourers have to cut them with sickles, bind them into sheaves, carry them from the field, and dry them enough to store safely. Every stage depended on conditions that 1315 seemed determined not to provide. Wheat was especially vulnerable. It was the prestige grain, the grain of white bread for the wealthy, and when supplies allowed for many town dwellers. But wheat generally demanded better land and a reasonably reliable growing season. Too much wet weather could encourage disease, weaken the stalks, and delay ripening. A field of wheat, flattened by wind and rain, its stalks bent down into the mud, was not merely unattractive. It was a disaster. The heads could rot close to the ground. Harvesters could struggle to cut them cleanly, Grain that had begun to sprout while still standing in the field might no longer make good bread at all. Rye was often hardier. It could grow on poorer soils and tolerate colder conditions better than wheat. For that reason, it was a vital grain across much of northern and eastern Europe, especially for people who could not rely on the best fields. But hardier did not mean invincible. Rye still needed to ripen. It still needed to be cut and dried. A wet, cold season could leave its grain underdeveloped, its harvest delayed, and its sheaves vulnerable once they were standing in the field. Barley had its own problem. It was used for food, for animal feed, and crucially for brewing. In a world where ale and beer were everyday drinks, a poor barley harvest did more than reduce calories. It threatened one of the safest and most familiar sources of liquid nourishment. Oats mattered too. People ate them, especially in poorer households in colder regions, but oats were also essential feed for horses. A failed oat crop could weaken the very animals needed to plough, haul, travel, and bring whatever food remained to market. This is the thing about medieval farming. The crops were not separate problems. Wheat fed people, rye fed people, barley fed people and supplied drink. Oats fed people and animals. Hay fed the animals that made agriculture possible in the first place. When bad weather damaged all of them at once, it did not create one shortage. It created a system failure, and the harvest itself was becoming an ordeal. Picture a village waiting for a break in the weather. The grain is not fully ready, but the sky has cleared for a day, maybe two. Everyone who can work goes into the fields. Men and women cut with sickles. Children help gather and bind. The work is urgent because another storm may be coming. But wet stalks are harder to handle. Mud grips at boots and wheels. Carts sink into field tracks. A load that should have reached the barn by evening may sit exposed, waiting for a road firm enough to cross. Then the rain returns. A sheaf left too long in wet conditions could mildew or rot. Grain spread to dry might be soaked again before it could be gathered. And grain that looked acceptable in the field could still prove dangerous once it reached storage. That was another trap waiting at the end of the season. Medieval people understood, through painful experience, that grain had to be dry before it went into a granary. Damp grain heated, it moulded, it attracted pests. It could spoil in ways that were not always obvious until a household opened its store months later and found that part of its winter food had turned foul. The ideal harvest was not simply grain cut from the field. It was grain cut, dried, threshed, winnowed, and stored in a condition that would last until the next harvest. In a wet year, every one of those steps became more difficult. Threshing was often done later, through autumn and winter, as households needed grain for milling. But if the sheaves entered storage damp, the problem had already begun. A farmer might preserve enough grain to survive the immediate season, only to discover in January or February that mould had ruined part of the supply. A lord's granary might look full from outside, while the contents deteriorated within. A town that bought grain after harvest might find it was buying food that would not keep. This is one reason famine was not always visible the moment a harvest went wrong. At first there might still be grain in barns. There might still be bread in markets. People could convince themselves that the damage was limited. Perhaps the yield was poor, but not disastrous. Perhaps another estate had done better. Perhaps traders would bring supplies from somewhere else. But harvest figures where they survive, and later reports of soaring prices point toward a brutal reality. In many areas, the usable grain supply was shrinking. Not every field failed completely. Not every region suffered equally. Medieval sources do not allow us to calculate a precise continental percentage of crop loss. When later writers describe universal ruin, fields producing nothing at all, or rain falling every day without pause, those phrases should be treated carefully. They are the language of people trying to describe a world that had become frighteningly abnormal. Still, beneath the dramatic language is a pattern historians take seriously. The harvest was poor, in some places very poor, and it was poor over a wide enough area that local recovery became much harder. Then there was the hay. Hay rarely receives the same attention as bread grain, but for a medieval farming community it could decide whether the next year was possible. Animals needed pasture in summer, but they needed stored fodder through winter and early spring. Oxen pulled ploughs, horses carried people and goods, hauled carts, and served armies. Cows provided milk, sheep supplied wool, meat, and manure. Pigs could forage more independently than other livestock, but even they were affected when weather damaged woodland food and disrupted the farm economy around them. To make hay, grass had to be cut during a dry enough interval, then left to cure before being stacked. Rain during haymaking could ruin the crop almost as efficiently as rain during grain harvest. Cut grass, repeatedly soaked, lost nutritional value and began to decay. A farmer could gather it anyway, because leaving it in the meadow meant losing it for certain. But poor hay meant hungry animals when winter came, and hungry draft animals meant fields that might not be ploughed properly the following spring. That is how one wet summer reached forward into the next agricultural year. Less hay weakened oxen and horses. Weakened animals pulled less effectively. Fewer fields could be worked on time. Fewer acres sown meant another reduced harvest. The rain was not just destroying food in 1315. It was stripping away the tools needed to recover from 1315. For farmers, this must have felt like watching the whole year collapse in slow motion. First, the ground was too wet to sow. Then the crop grew badly. Then it would not ripen. Then it could not be gathered dry. Then the grain that was gathered might not keep. Then the animals had too little fodder for winter. And behind every failed step stood the same question. What happens when the old stores run out? By the end of the growing season, the answer was beginning to emerge. The problem was no longer trapped in waterlogged fields and damp barns. It was moving outward toward mills, village markets, merchant warehouses, and city gates. The harvest had failed to provide what Europe needed. Now Europe would discover what happened when too many people began chasing too little grain. That chase began in the village. A farmer who had brought in a poor harvest had a problem that sounds simple until you imagine living it. He needed grain to feed his household. He needed seed grain for the next planting. He might owe rent to his lord, tithes to the church, dues to a manor, and debts to a merchant or neighbour. If he owned animals, he needed feed for them too. And if the grain in his barn had gone damp or mouldy, the pile he thought would carry his family through winter was smaller than it looked. So he sold less. Or he did not sell at all. That decision made sense for one household. It was survival, but multiply it across hundreds of villages, across thousands of farms, and the grain flowing toward market began to thin out. Normally a medieval town did not feed itself. It depended on the countryside around it. Carts came in from nearby villages, carrying sacks of wheat, rye, barley, oats, beans, peas, cheese, meat, and firewood. Millers bought grain, bakers bought flour, brewers bought barley. Merchants bought whatever they could store and sell later. The market was the place where the surplus of the countryside became the food of the town. But in 1315 there was less surplus. The village did not have much to spare. And what it did had suddenly become more valuable than almost anything else. That is when prices began to climb. Not smoothly, not evenly, not everywhere at the same speed. A bad harvest in one district could raise prices in the nearest town within weeks. but a place with a river connection, access to a port, or merchants able to draw on supplies from farther away might hold out longer. One manor might have reserves in its granary, another might have nothing. A coastal town could hope for grain by ship, while an inland settlement depended on roads that were turning into mud. So the famine did not produce one single price. It produced a map of fear. In one market, wheat might be expensive, but still available. In another, it might be almost impossible to find. Rye, the bread grain of many poorer households, could rise sharply as people who could no longer afford wheat turned toward it. Then rye became scarce too. Barley and oats, grains often treated as lower status food, were pulled into the same crisis. People ate what they could get. The surviving records show this pressure in fragments. Manorial account rolls, town accounts, monastic purchases, household records kept by institutions wealthy enough to write things down. They list what was bought, what it cost, and sometimes what had to be paid for grain that, in a normal year, would have been much cheaper. These records can be startling. In parts of England, grain prices rose dramatically after the failed harvest of 1315, with some markets seeing the price of wheat reach 2, 3, or more times ordinary levels. But the exact increase varied enormously. A price from one English county cannot simply be treated as the price of Europe. Nor can the price paid by a monastery, a royal household, or a city government tell us exactly what a poor labourer paid at a village market. Still, when records from different places begin showing the same basic movement, the pattern is hard to ignore. Grain was becoming painfully expensive. And for the poor, this was not an inconvenience. It was a trap. A wealthy lord might spend a larger sum on food in a famine year, but food was only part of his wealth. He had land, rents, livestock, stored goods, political connections. He might substitute one kind of bread for another, cut back on feasts, sell an animal, borrow against future income, or order grain from an estate that had suffered less. A labourer had none of those buffers. For poor households, food already consumed most of the budget in ordinary times. Not half, not a comfortable share that left room for savings. In many cases, bread and grain took up the overwhelming majority of what a family earned. A day labourer might be paid in coin, food, or a mixture of both, but his wages did not suddenly triple because wheat had tripled. That is the central cruelty of price inflation. The price rises. Your income stays nearly the same, and because you cannot stop eating, every other part of life gets sacrificed first. Clothing is not replaced. Tools are pawned. Small animals are sold. A household burns through its savings if it had any. Then it borrows. Then it falls behind on rent. Then it buys less grain, and poorer grain, and finally whatever substance can be made to seem like food. And there was another force making the market worse. Hoarding, the word, can make us picture a villainous merchant locking away sacks of grain while children starve outside. That happened often enough to become a deep public fear. Medieval towns repeatedly accused merchants, millers, bakers, and grain dealers of withholding supplies in hopes of selling later at a higher price. Authorities sometimes tried to regulate prices, inspect granaries, punish dishonest waits, or prevent grain from leaving a district. But hoarding was not only the work of speculators. Every household that feared hunger tried to keep more grain back. Every lord with a granary had reason to protect his own tenants and household. Every merchant who had bought grain early faced a choice: sell now, when prices were high, or wait, when they might be higher still. In a crisis, ordinary self-protection and deliberate profiteering could look very similar from outside the storehouse door. And the weather made everything worse. Europe did have grain trade. It was not a sealed world of isolated villages. Merchants moved food along rivers, across seas, and overland between regions. But moving bulk grain was difficult even in good conditions. It was heavy. It needed sacks, carts, boats, animals, labour, storage, credit, and roads that could actually be used. Now imagine trying to do that through months of rain. Roads became trenches of mud, wagon wheels bogged down, horses weakened because oats and hay were scarce. River travel could be disrupted by floods, swollen currents, and damaged crossings. Grain carried in damp conditions faced spoilage. A merchant might know that grain was available 50 miles away and still be unable to bring enough of it to the people who needed it. This is why famine can exist beside food. Some districts had better harvests than others. Some storehouses still held grain. Some traders still moved shipments. But the question was not simply whether food existed somewhere. The question was whether it could reach the market, in usable condition, at a price ordinary people could pay. For more and more families the answer was no. By late 1315 and into the following year, the market was delivering a brutal lesson. Money could still buy grain for those who had enough of it. But coin did not make fields dry. It did not make carts move through flooded roads. It did not refill a granary already emptied by a failed harvest. And as bread became dearer, Europe's poorest people began changing what they ate, how much they ate, and eventually what they were willing to call food at all. At first, the change was almost invisible. A loaf became darker. Not necessarily because the baker was trying to cheat anyone, though some probably did. Wheat was expensive. Fine white bread was becoming a luxury. So households that had once eaten wheat bread turned to rye. Those who had eaten rye turned to barley or oats, and those who had already depended on barley and oats had nowhere lower to go except whatever could be stretched, ground, boiled, or mixed into something that looked enough like a meal. Bread remained the centre of the medieval diet, not the side dish, not something served beside the real food. For millions of people, bread was food. A labourer might begin the day with it, carry it to the fields, eat it again at night with a little pottage, perhaps some onions, peas, cabbage, cheese or ale, if the household was fortunate. When the bread failed, the entire diet began to fail around it. The flour itself became worse. Grain that had been damp in the field or spoiled in storage could be milled anyway, because throwing it away was no longer an option. Bakers could blend different grains together. They could bulk out flour with bran. They could produce loaves that were coarse, heavy, dark, and less nourishing than what people had eaten in better years. And even that bread became smaller. This is one of the ways famine works before anyone dies dramatically in the street. The meal does not vanish all at once. It shrinks. The loaf is cut into thinner pieces. The pot contains more water. A family that once ate twice a day eats once properly and once lightly. Parents begin making calculations they do not say aloud. Which child is weakest? Who has to work tomorrow? Who can be given the larger share without leaving everyone else with nothing? Then the substitutions begin. People gathered wild plants that in ordinary years might have been ignored or used only in small amounts. Leaves, roots, herbs, berries when they could be found, nuts, acorns, and whatever the woods, hedgerows, marshes, and commons could provide. They dug for roots. They collected grasses and edible weeds. They stripped food from places already familiar to poor rural households, but now they did it more intensely earlier in the season and alongside everyone else. That last part mattered. Foraging sounds like a solution until you picture an entire village doing it. A few families can gather greens from the edge of a wood. Hundreds of hungry people can strip that landscape quickly. The first plants disappear, then the less desirable plants. Then things that are difficult to digest, bitter, or potentially dangerous if prepared badly. The countryside itself became another contested storehouse, one with no locked doors but very limited supplies. People also ate seed grain, and that was one of the most dangerous decisions a household could make. Seed grain was not just food put aside for later. It was the next harvest in physical form. In autumn and spring, farmers needed grain to sow their fields. Eat that reserve, and you might survive another week. But when planting time came, there would be less to put in the ground. Less seed meant fewer acres planted meant a smaller harvest, even if the weather improved. It was like burning the beams of your house to stay warm through one night. The fire solves the immediate problem, but it leaves you more exposed when morning comes. Of course, people did eat seed grain. Hunger makes long-term planning a privilege. A mother looking at hungry children could not simply preserve a sack of grain, because next year might be worse. The future was important, but the present was starving, and so the famine began feeding on itself. The bad harvest of 1315 created scarcity. Scarcity pushed families to consume reserves. Consuming reserves weakened the next planting. Then the rains continued. Another harvest came under pressure. Another year arrived with fewer stores, fewer animals, fewer seeds, and fewer ways to absorb a shock. This was not one failed meal. It was a process of nutritional collapse. At first, people lost variety. Meat disappeared from poor tables. Dairy became scarce when animals had too little fodder. Fish could help in some regions, especially near coasts and rivers, but it could not feed everyone, and bad weather could disrupt fishing too. Beans and peas, valuable sources of protein, were also vulnerable to poor harvests. Ale, often safer than water and an important source of calories, became harder to brew when grain was too precious to spare. Then people lost quantity. A body can endure reduced food for a while. It burns stored fat. It slows down. It weakens. Work becomes harder, which is cruel because the people most likely to be underfed were often the people expected to dig, carry, plough, repair, and harvest. A hungry farm worker had to perform the labour that might save the next crop while consuming less and less fuel to do it. Children suffered especially badly. Their bodies needed food not merely to keep going, but to grow. Older people had fewer reserves. Pregnant women faced added risks. And anyone already ill, injured, or poor before the famine began entered the crisis from a weaker starting point. Starvation, in other words, was rarely a single moment when someone simply had no food at all. More often it was weeks and months of too little food, poor food, spoiled food, and food without enough protein, fat, or micronutrients. A person might still be walking, still working, still alive, but their body was becoming less able to fight infection, recover from injury, or survive the next cold night. Medieval chroniclers try to describe what they saw, and some of their accounts are horrifying. They wrote of people eating dogs, cats, horses, and animals that would normally never appear on the table. Some described people eating the bodies of the dead. Others repeated stories of parents abandoning children, of murder for food, even of cannibalism. These accounts cannot all be treated the same way. Chroniclers often wrote with moral and religious purpose. Famine, in their eyes, could be a warning from God, a punishment for sin, or proof that the world had fallen into disorder. Extreme stories carried meaning. They showed a society pushed beyond the boundaries of what decent people believed human beings could do. That does not mean every story was invented. People certainly slaughtered animals they would usually have kept. Horses, in particular, were valuable working animals, but a starving household might eventually choose meat today over labour tomorrow. Abandonment, theft, and desperate acts are entirely plausible in a crisis of this scale. But the most sensational claims are harder to verify. A chronicler repeating a tale from another region was not conducting an investigation. Sometimes the story tells us more clearly about the terror people felt than about exactly what happened in one village on one day. What the evidence does show beyond doubt is grim enough. By 1316, many people were no longer choosing between good food and bad food. They were choosing between bad food and no food. They were eating their reserves, their seed, their animals, the plants around them, and eventually the foundations of their own future survival. And as the diet narrowed, bodies narrowed with it. The famine was no longer just an economic crisis measured in prices and grain sacks. It was entering people's bones, their immune systems, their pregnancies, their childhoods. It was making an entire population weaker just as the worst years of the disaster were still ahead. But hunger did not fall evenly across the countryside. A medieval village could look like a single community from a distance. One church, one cluster of houses, fields spreading outward in long strips. Everyone dependent on the same weather, everyone watching the same grey sky. But when the harvest failed, people did not face the disaster with the same resources. Some peasants held land under relatively secure customary terms. They had a house, a few strips in the open fields, perhaps rights to graze animals on common pasture, gather firewood, or turn pigs into the woods in autumn. In a normal year, that was not prosperity. It was survival with a narrow margin. But a household with a cow, a few chickens, a pig, stored grain, and family members old enough to work, had more ways to absorb a bad season than a landless labourer with nothing except wages. And wages became a problem when everyone was hungry. A labourer depended on finding work by the day, the week, or the season. Ploughing, weeding, haymaking, harvesting, ditch digging, carrying timber, repairing fences. But farmers whose own crops had failed did not always have money to hire extra hands. Lords trying to preserve their estates could cut costs. Smallholders facing empty stores could not pay a neighbour simply because that neighbour needed bread. For landless people, the famine could arrive fast. No grain reserve, no animals to sell, no rights to a field that might eventually produce something. Just a body that had to keep working in order to eat, becoming weaker at exactly the moment work was hardest to find. Then there were the tenants. Their land was not fully theirs in the modern sense. They held it from a lord, a monastery, a bishop, or some other landholder. And that relationship came with obligations. Rent might be paid in cash, in grain, in animals, in labour, or in a mixture of all four. A tenant might owe days of work on the lord's own fields. He might owe payments at harvest time. He might owe fees for using the lord's mill, the lord's oven, the lord's court. In some places, customary obligations were tightly defined. In others, lords had more room to press their claims. Now picture what that meant in 1315. Your crop has rotted in the ground. What you did manage to bring in is damp, thin, and barely enough to feed your children. Your seed grain is already being eaten. Your cow is giving less milk because there is too little fodder. And then rent day comes. The obligation has not disappeared just because the harvest has. Some landlords did reduce rents, delay payments, distribute grain, or relax labour services. They had reasons to dead or ruined tenants could not cultivate fields next year. An estate worked only if people remained alive to work it. Monasteries and great lords also had reputations to protect, religious duties to fulfill, and communities watching every decision they made. But compassion had limits, and landlords had pressures too. They owed debts. They had households to feed, servants to pay, armed retainers to maintain, buildings to repair. Their own demesne farms had suffered in the same reign. A lord might need grain for his household precisely when his tenants had the least ability to provide it. And officials sent to collect dues could be far less flexible than the distant owner whose name appeared in the records. So the countryside became a place of constant calculation. Do you give the best remaining grain to your family? Do you save it for seed? Do you hand it over as rent and hope the Lord will show mercy later? Do you feed the ox that pulls the plough, even if that means your children eat less tonight? That last choice was especially brutal. Oxen and horses were not simply property. They were productive power. Without an ox team, ploughing heavy northern soils became almost impossible for a small household. Without a horse carrying grain, hauling wood, travelling to market, and doing hired work became harder. But animals ate in a famine. They ate food that people desperately needed. A household might sell livestock before slaughtering it. A cow could bring cash. A horse, even exhausted and underfed, might pay a debt or purchase grain. Pigs could be sold, sheep could be sold, tools could be sold. First went what could be spared, then what could not. But this was not a normal market. When thousands of households were trying to sell animals at once, prices could collapse. Everyone wanted grain. Fewer people could afford livestock. And animals themselves were losing value as they weakened from lack of fodder. A family might trade away a cow that had taken years to acquire for enough food to last only a few days or weeks. The sale kept them alive. It also made survival next year more difficult. No cow meant no milk, no calves, no manure to fertilize the fields. No ox meant no easy ploughing. No sheep meant less wool to sell. Fewer lambs, less security. The famine did not merely empty cupboards. It stripped rural households of the small productive assets that let them rebuild after a bad year. Debt filled the gap. People borrowed grain from neighbours, merchants, clergy, village officials, or wealthier farmers. They pawned tools and clothing. They promised future labour. They mortgaged or surrendered rights to land. Credit could be a lifeline. It could carry a household through the hungry months until another harvest. But when the next harvest failed too, debt turned from bridge into trap. A tenant unable to pay might lose his holding. A smallholder might give up strips of land to someone with cash. A widow without adult sons might find it especially difficult to keep a tenancy going. Families could break apart as people left in search of work, food, or relatives willing to take them in. Some moved toward towns. Some moved to other villages. Some followed roads toward places rumoured to have grain, charitable institutions, wealthy patrons, or better wages. But migration was not an escape hatch waiting at the edge of the parish. Towns had hungry people too. Roads were muddy, dangerous, and expensive. A stranger arriving with no tools, no money, and no local connections might find closed doors rather than opportunity. Still, when staying meant watching the last food disappear, leaving could feel like the only choice left. And yet, the countryside did not simply collapse all at once. People had strategies developed over generations of living close to the edge. Families pooled resources. Neighbours extended small loans. Kin networks took in children or elderly relatives. Villages used common rights more intensely, gathering wood, cutting turf, fishing, trapping, foraging, grazing, whatever animals remained where they could. Households shifted labour. Women, children, and older people contributed more gathering, spinning, selling, and food preparation, while able-bodied workers searched for employment. Some communities organised grain purchases. Some monasteries and churches distributed alms. Some lords, recognizing the danger of losing their tenants entirely, offered temporary relief or allowed payments to be postponed. These measures mattered. They delayed catastrophe. They saved particular families. They kept a few fields planted that otherwise would have gone empty. They explain why famine was not a single uniform experience, why one household survived while another, only a few doors away, disappeared from the records. But resilience was not the same as safety. Every strategy consumed something. Savings, animals, land, credit, family ties, the strength to work. And after one failed harvest, perhaps those reserves could be stretched. After two, they were nearly gone. The rain had ruined the crops. But now the damage was spreading through the entire structure of rural life, through rents and debts, animals and tools, families and villages, all the fragile arrangements that turned land into food. And soon people fleeing the villages would discover something even more frightening. The cities could not eat money. For centuries, towns had seemed like places apart. Behind their walls were merchants, guilds, workshops, churches, markets, courts, warehouses, and houses packed close together along narrow streets. A town might mint coins, collect tolls, lend money, import cloth from Flanders, wine from France, spices from the Mediterranean, timber from distant forests. It could be rich. It could be powerful. It could have stone walls strong enough to resist an army. But it could not grow grain between its streets. A city ate because the countryside around it kept sending food inward. Carts of wheat and rye, barrels of oats, beans, peas, onions, cheese, salted meat, fish, firewood, hay. Every market day the gates opened and the rural world flowed into town. Farmers arrived with sacks over their shoulders. Peddlers came with eggs and poultry. Millers, carriers, butchers, brewers and grain dealers turned crops into the daily calories of urban life. In a normal year, this system was so familiar that it could almost disappear from view. Bread was there in the baker's stall, ale was there in the tavern, flour was there at the mill. The city's people worked leather, iron, cloth, wood and stone because someone else was growing the grain. Then the rains came, and suddenly every town in northern Europe faced the same terrible fact. Money could buy grain only if grain existed to be bought. At first, urban governments did what governments had learned to do whenever food became scarce. They regulated, they inspected, they commanded. Many towns already had rules controlling the grain trade and the price, weight, and quality of bread. Bread was too important to leave entirely to chance. A baker who made loaves too small used poor flour, or charged too much could face fines. Market officials checked measures. Authorities tried to stop merchants from buying up grain before it reached the public market. In some places they restricted exports, hoping to keep local supplies from leaving for a more profitable destination. These rules made sense in an ordinary shortage. If one merchant was hoarding grain to force prices higher, officials could punish him. If bakers were secretly shrinking loaves, inspectors could catch them. If grain was being carried out of town while local people went hungry, the gates could be watched. But regulations could not command the fields to dry. They could not make a wet harvest ripen. They could not transform spoiled grain into bread. And this was the nightmare of 1315. The problem was not just that food was being distributed unfairly. That certainly happened. Wealthier people often had better access to grain, better credit, stronger connections, and the ability to buy early before prices climbed further. But underneath all the arguments over price and profit was a deeper failure. The regional food supply itself was collapsing. A town could send agents into the countryside to purchase grain. It could offer high prices, it could borrow money. It could call on wealthy citizens to contribute. It could seize supplies in extreme circumstances, or pressure merchants to sell. But the agents sent out to find food encountered the same answer again and again. There was little to sell, or what remained was being kept for seed, or it had already been promised to a landlord, a creditor, a monastery, a neighbouring town, or a merchant with more silver. That is when a city's wealth became strangely fragile. Picture a prosperous cloth town. Its merchants have cash. Its guilds have funds. Its rulers can levy taxes. But its weavers do not eat wool. Its goldsmiths do not eat silver. Its lawyers do not eat parchment. A town might contain enormous wealth on paper, in chests, in debts owed, in warehouses full of valuable goods. Yet none of that filled an empty granary. In fact, famine could make urban wealth less useful. If everyone needed grain at once, the price rose beyond anything familiar. Coin chased food. The people with coin bought first. The people without it waited, borrowed, sold possessions, or went without. And the town's poor were many day labourers, porters, servants, widows, apprentices, elderly people with no family support, artisans whose work depended on customers with money to spend. A shoemaker could not sell many shoes to hungry people. A weaver could not count on orders when households were spending every last coin on bread. Famine was not only a crisis of food, it was a collapse in demand, wages and work. Then came the tensions. Merchants were accused of withholding grain. Sometimes the accusations reflected real profiteering. Grain dealers had every reason to wait if they believed prices would rise next week. But not every merchant with grain was a villain. Some had contracts to fulfill. Some had borrowed heavily to purchase supplies. Some were trying to preserve enough stock to last through the season. And some simply understood what everyone else understood. If they sold everything today, there might be nothing tomorrow. Bakers stood in the middle of the anger. They needed flour. They needed fuel for ovens. They needed workers. And when grain prices rose, bread prices had to rise too, unless the baker accepted losses that could quickly ruin him. Officials might order a fixed price, but then bakers could respond by making loaves smaller, using coarser flour, mixing in inferior ingredients, or shutting their ovens rather than selling at a loss. Hungry residents did not always see these calculations. They saw a loaf getting smaller. They saw a stall with no bread left. They saw carts entering the town under guard while their children cried from hunger. So municipal officials were trapped as well. If they let prices rise freely, the poor could starve and unrest could follow. If they imposed prices too harshly, sellers might hide grain or bring it elsewhere. If they banned exports, neighbouring communities suffered. If they requisitioned grain, they risked destroying trust with merchants and rural suppliers. Every solution shifted pain from one group to another. Some cities had advantages. Ports and river towns could sometimes draw on wider trade networks. Grain might arrive by ship or barge from regions that had suffered less badly. Coastal communities could supplement diets with fish. Major commercial centres had credit, merchants with long-distance contacts, and the political influence to compete for supplies. But trade was not magic. Ships could be delayed, rivers could flood, roads turned to mud, and when bad weather damaged harvests across broad regions, every town was sending buyers outward at the same time. The richer city might outbid the smaller one. It might survive a little longer. But it was still competing for a shrinking pool of food. More isolated towns faced an even harsher reality. A market centre far from navigable water, surrounded by equally hungry villages, could not simply order grain from somewhere else. Transport was slow and expensive, even in good conditions. A wagon load of grain moved across wet roads was not just food. It was food being consumed by horses, drivers, guards, and time. The farther it travelled, the more expensive it became. And as desperate people continued arriving from the countryside, the pressure grew. The cities had been imagined as refuges, places with walls, markets, churches, and wealthy citizens. But walls could keep enemies out. They could not keep hunger out. By 1315, towns across northern Europe were learning that civilization rested on something astonishingly basic. Not coin, not law, not stone walls, bread. And when bread became scarce, hunger began changing the bodies of the people who remained. Hunger does not stay in the stomach. It moves outward. First, there is the weakness, the dizziness, the cold that seems to reach deeper into the body than it should. Muscles lose strength. A person who once worked behind a plough from dawn to dusk now struggles to carry a bucket of water. A mother has less milk for an infant. An older person who might have survived an ordinary winter finds that one fever, one chest infection, one bout of diarrhea becomes something far more dangerous. Because food was not just comfort, it was fuel, it was repair. It was the raw material the body used to maintain itself against cold, wounds, parasites, and disease. When the harvests failed, people did not always fall dead immediately. That is one of the most important things to understand about famine. Starvation could be slow. Families stretched whatever food they had. They ate less often, they cut portions. Adults might go without, so children could have something. Bread was made with poorer flour. Grain intended for animals was brought into human diets. People turned to foods that were normally a last resort. Leaves, roots, bark, wild plants, perhaps anything that could be boiled, chewed, or ground into a kind of meal. Some of these foods offered calories, some offered very little. Some could make people ill. And even when a household was not literally eating nothing, a diet stripped of grain, protein, fats, and variety could leave bodies increasingly vulnerable. Medieval people did not speak of vitamins, calories, or immune systems. They had other explanations for illness: corrupted air, divine punishment, imbalances within the body, poisoned water, planetary influences. But they knew what hunger looked like. They knew that people who had gone too long without food became thin, weak, pale, exhausted, and more likely to die when sickness arrived. Modern medicine gives us part of the missing mechanism. Prolonged malnutrition weakens the body's defences. It makes recovery harder. It can leave wounds slower to heal and infections more dangerous. A disease that a well-fed person might survive can become fatal for someone already depleted by months of hunger. And in 1315, hunger was happening in exactly the conditions that helped illness spread. Think about the landscape. Fields saturated with water, roads turned into ruts of mud and manure, flooded ground around villages and towns, damp houses with poor ventilation, crowded rooms shared by families, servants, lodgers, animals, and refugees who had left the countryside searching for food. Clean water was never guaranteed in medieval Europe. In a wet year, wells, streams, and storage areas could be contaminated more easily. Waste disposal was already a problem in dense towns. Now rain carried filth through streets and into waterways. Nobody needed to understand bacteria to understand that something was wrong. The sources tell us of sickness. They tell us of death. They tell us of communities under strain, but they rarely give us the neat diagnostic labels a modern historian would want. A medieval chronicler might describe a great mortality, a pestilence, fever, flux, swelling, weakness, or sudden death. Those words could refer to many different conditions: dysentery, typhoid-like infections, respiratory diseases, intestinal illnesses, epidemic infections carried through crowded populations, diseases we can no longer identify with confidence from a few lines on parchment. So historians have to be careful. We cannot simply read the word pestilence in a 14th century chronicle and announce that we know which pathogen was responsible. We cannot reconstruct every death certificate because almost nobody had one. Parish records from this early period are incomplete, uneven, and often absent. Monastic accounts, manorial rolls, city records, and chronicles preserve fragments, not a full census of suffering. But fragments can still reveal a pattern. When records show unusually high numbers of deaths, abandoned holdings, missing tenants, emergency charity, rising burial activity, or communities struggling to collect rents and taxes because people were gone, those clues matter. When chroniclers in different regions describe hunger followed by sickness and mortality, that matters too. No single source tells the whole story. Together, they show a society being pushed far beyond ordinary hardship, and the effects were not distributed equally. The wealthy suffered from high prices and uncertainty. They might have to reduce the size of their households, sell goods, borrow money, or watch rents disappear. But many still had stores, connections, land in different places, and the power to purchase what remained. The poor had almost no margin. A labourer who depended on daily wages could not build a private granary. A widow with no land could not wait for next year's harvest. A child, an elderly person, a pregnant woman, a sick worker, anyone already living close to the edge, could be pulled under first. That is how famine makes disease deadlier, without needing one single mysterious epidemic to explain everything. Hunger weakened the body. Dampness and crowding increased exposure. Poor sanitation created new risks. Cold consumed energy that people no longer had. Work did not stop simply because people were underfed. Wood still had to be gathered. Water still had to be carried. Fields still had to be worked, even when the soil was too wet to reward the effort. Every task took more from bodies that had less to give. And this was not the Black Death, that later catastrophe arriving in Europe in the late 1340s, killed with a speed and scale that left a different kind of mark on the historical record. The Great Famine was not one disease sweeping across the continent in a single wave. It was a prolonged environmental and nutritional crisis. Its deaths came through hunger itself, through illnesses made worse by hunger, through exposure, exhaustion, and the breakdown of ordinary survival. The distinction matters, but for the people living through 1315, the difference may have felt less important than it does to us. A child wasting away, a neighbour dying after fever and diarrhoea, a household with no bread, a grave dug in wet ground. The rains had ruined the harvest. Now they were helping turn scarcity into mortality. But hunger did not stop with people. It moved into the barns, the stables, the muddy pens behind the houses. It reached the animals that made medieval life possible. And this was another disaster hidden inside the first one. A bad grain harvest meant less bread. Everyone understood that. But the same endless rain that ruined wheat, rye and barley also damaged the crops and grasslands needed to keep animals alive through winter. Hay could not be cut properly, or it was cut too late, after rain had flattened it into wet, rotting masses. Fodder stored in barns could spoil. Pastures became waterlogged. Animals standing day after day in cold mud burned energy just trying to stay warm, while the food available to them became scarcer and poorer. For a modern person, losing livestock might sound like one more financial loss in a bad year. For medieval Europe it was much worse. A horse was transport. It was strength. It pulled carts loaded with grain, timber, firewood, manure and people. On larger farms and estates, horses could pull ploughs. They carried messages, supplies, merchants, clergy and officials along roads already turning into rivers of mud. Even the war horses of nobles depended on the same fragile system of hay, oats, pasture, and labour. An ox was even more fundamental. Oxen were the engines of the field. They pulled the heavy ploughs needed to work northern European soils. A village might organise its agricultural year around shared teams of draft animals. One peasant household could possess part of an ox team, while neighbours supplied the rest. Together they ploughed strips of land none of them could have worked alone. Now imagine what happens when those animals begin to weaken. An underfed ox does not simply become thinner, it pulls less. It tires faster. It gets sick more easily. It may not survive the winter. And if it dies, the loss is not limited to the meat that can be salvaged from its body. The village has lost the power needed to plough next season's fields. That meant less land prepared for planting. Less land planted meant less grain harvested. And less grain meant even less food for people and animals when the next winter came. This is how the famine became self-reinforcing. The crisis did not reset when one harvest failed. It carried damage forward, season after season, turning one bad year into a trap. Some households slaughtered animals because they had no choice. A cow, sheep, or pig still represented food in the immediate present. If a family could not feed it through the winter, killing it early might seem better than watching it starve. But that decision came with a terrible cost. A slaughtered cow could no longer give milk. A breeding sow could no longer produce piglets. A ewe could no longer provide lambs, wool, or milk. An ox killed for meat would not pull a plough in spring. People were consuming their future in order to survive the present. And sometimes they did not even get that choice. Animals died from hunger, exposure, and disease. Wet conditions were dangerous in their own right. Constant damp could contribute to foot problems, infections, and weakened condition. Spoiled fodder could make animals ill. Crowded pens and exhausted herds created opportunities for disease to spread. Medieval records do not always allow historians to identify exactly what killed a particular herd in a particular village. But accounts from the famine years point to serious livestock losses in several regions, especially among animals already strained by shortages of feed. Cattle were especially valuable, which made their loss especially painful. They supplied meat, certainly. But most families could not afford to kill cattle casually in normal years. A living cow was more useful than a dead one. It provided milk, butter, cheese, and calves. It could turn grass, which humans could not digest, into food people could eat. In a world without refrigeration, cheese and butter also helped preserve the value of summer milk for later months. When cattle numbers fell, dairy production fell with them. That mattered because dairy was one of the few relatively accessible sources of protein and fat for many rural households. Not everyone had regular access to meat. A labourer might eat bread, pottage, onions, beans when available, and perhaps small amounts of bacon, cheese, or milk. Remove the milk, remove the cheese, remove the fat. The diet becomes even poorer, exactly when bodies need more strength to endure cold, work, and illness. Sheep losses had their own consequences. Sheep offered meat and milk, but also wool. Wool was not just clothing, it was a major commodity, especially in England and parts of the Low Countries. It fed local crafts, long-distance trade, and the incomes of landlords and monasteries. Fewer sheep meant less wool. Less wool meant less income, precisely when communities needed money to buy imported grain or pay debts. Pigs, meanwhile, were often the animal of the household poor. They could forage in woods, consume scraps, and turn waste into meat. But famine altered that equation too. When acorns and forest food were poor, when households had no scraps to spare, when people themselves were eating whatever grain they could find, pigs became harder to maintain. Many were slaughtered young. That provided a brief meal. It also reduced the next generation of animals. And then there was manure. It sounds unglamorous, but manure was fertility. In a farming system with limited access to artificial fertilizer, animal dung helped sustain fields year after year. Cattle, horses, sheep, and pigs all played a role in returning nutrients to the soil. Fewer animals meant less manure. Less manure could mean poorer yields later, especially on land already exhausted by intensive cultivation and bad weather. The animals were part of the agricultural system, not separate from it. They pulled the plough, they fertilized the ground, they carried goods to market. They produced milk, cheese, meat, wool, leather, hides, grease, bone and labour. When they died, the whole system lost capacity at once. And there was another cruel complication. Replacing livestock took time. A farmer could plant seed and, in a good year, see a crop within months. But rebuilding a herd was slower. A calf had to be born, raised and matured. A foal took years before it became a working horse. An ox team could not be restored overnight, especially when surviving animals were expensive and cash was scarce. As livestock became rarer, prices rose. The people most in need of replacement animals were often the least able to buy them. If you want to explore more strange turning points in history, you can get the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries through our website. The link is in the description. But back in 1315, no mystery was needed to explain what villagers saw. They could see the chain forming around them. No hay meant weak animals. Weak animals meant less milk, less meat, less transport, less manure, less ploughing. Less ploughing meant a weaker harvest. And a weaker harvest meant the famine was already waiting on the other side of winter. The rain had not merely taken food from the fields. It had begun dismantling the machinery that made food possible. And when the machinery of survival began to break down, people looked for help wherever help might still exist. For many, that meant the church. In medieval Europe, the church was not only a place people visited on Sunday. It was woven into almost every part of life. Priests baptized children, heard confessions, blessed marriages, buried the dead, and marked the passing of the agricultural year with feast days, fasts, and prayers. Monasteries owned land, managed farms, stored grain, employed labourers, and in some regions operated hospitals, guest houses, and systems of alms for the poor. When hunger arrived, clergy and religious houses could become some of the first places desperate people turned. A parish priest might distribute what his church had collected. A monastery might open its stores, bake bread, offer meals at its gate, or give coins and food to travellers, widows, the sick, and the landless poor. Bishops sometimes urged charitable giving. Wealthier laypeople, nobles, merchants, and officials could donate money or grain as acts of religious duty, hoping to relieve suffering and perhaps protect their own souls. This was not meaningless charity. For someone with no field, no livestock, no family able to help, a bowl of pottage from a monastery could mean surviving another day. But now picture the scale of the problem. One hungry traveller at a monastery gate is manageable. 10 is difficult. 100 is a crisis. Entire villages were short of food at the same time. Rural labourers, artisans, servants, widows, children and people already living close to poverty all needed help simultaneously. And the monasteries themselves were not standing outside the disaster. Their grain fields had been soaked by the same rain. Their tenants had suffered the same failed harvests. Their animals needed the same scarce fodder. Their rents, often paid partly in grain and produce, became harder to collect. The church had resources, but it did not have unlimited resources. A large abbey could possess storehouses, estates and land spread across several villages. that could make it more resilient than a single peasant household. One manor might have done slightly better than another. Grain might be shifted from one place to another if roads allowed it, and if there was grain to move. But a regional famine has a brutal way of overwhelming local reserves. Granaries built to bridge an ordinary winter were not designed to feed thousands of people through repeated harvest failures. And there was a difficult question behind every act of relief. Who should receive the last grain? The monks and nuns who lived there, the servants and labourers who depended on the institution, the poor at the gate, the tenants who owed labour and rent, travellers, orphans, the sick. There was no answer that did not leave someone hungry. Some religious communities gave generously and strained their own finances to do it. Others had to ration, borrow, sell property, or reduce the food provided to dependents. The surviving records often come from institutions capable of writing and preserving accounts, which means we can sometimes see the pressure building in the numbers, purchases becoming more expensive, rents failing to arrive, food allowances being adjusted, debts accumulating. Even institutions associated with charity could be forced into impossible calculations. And alongside practical relief came prayer. People prayed for dry weather. They prayed for a successful harvest. They prayed for the sick, for the dead, for protection from hunger, and for the rain to stop. Processions could move through streets and fields. Clergy might lead congregations in litanies, calling on saints for intercession. Bells rang. Masses were said. Fast days and acts of penance took on new urgency. To modern ears it can be tempting to call this superstition and move on. But that misses what these actions meant to the people taking part. Medieval Europeans did not separate weather, morality, politics, nature and religion as sharply as many people do today. The rain was a physical event. It ruined grain in a completely material way. But it could also be understood as part of a moral universe, a world in which God's purposes might be difficult to read, but were never thought irrelevant. For some, the disaster looked like divine punishment. Perhaps people had become sinful, greedy, violent, sexually immoral, or neglectful of the poor. Perhaps rulers had failed in their duties. Perhaps the community as a whole needed repentance. For others, famine was not necessarily a simple punishment with a simple cause. It could be a trial, a test of endurance, a mystery, a call to humility in the face of suffering no human being could control. And not everyone responded in the same way. One person might attend a procession with complete conviction. Another might go because the entire village was going. Someone else might pray desperately, while also blaming a landlord for hoarding grain. A starving mother did not need a formal theory of divine justice to understand that her children needed food. Faith, fear, anger, hope, and practical desperation could all exist in the same household at the same time. Still, the famine tested religious authority. The church taught that charity mattered. Now the poor could see whether the rich gave. It taught that clergy had spiritual responsibilities. Now people watched priests, monks, bishops, and abbots confront hunger in their own communities. It offered rituals meant to unite communities in crisis. But after prayers and processions, the rain could continue. That created a terrible tension. If the saints could be asked for help, why had help not come? If suffering was a punishment, why were infants suffering? If the church owned land and stored grain, why were people dying outside its doors? These were not necessarily questions people wrote down openly. Medieval society did not suddenly abandon religion in 1315, but famine made the gap between moral ideals and lived reality painfully visible. And it tested more than faith in the church. It tested confidence in the entire social order. Medieval society was built on obligations. Lords were expected, at least in theory, to protect dependents. Religious institutions were expected to show charity. Communities were expected to support their poor. The powerful were supposed to exercise justice. But when food itself became scarce, every obligation became harder to fulfill. A monastery could feed some people, but not everyone. A parish could pray, but it could not make wet grain ripen. A bishop could preach charity, but he could not summon bread from empty fields. The hunger was becoming too large for old systems of mercy to contain. And when people discover that prayer has not stopped the rain, charity has not filled the granaries, and authority cannot guarantee bread, desperation begins looking for other answers. And those other answers were often dangerous. When food becomes scarce, theft changes its meaning. A man stealing a loaf of bread is still stealing. A woman taking grain from a field before it is ripe is still breaking the law. But famine forces a question that medieval courts could not avoid. What happens when the people breaking the law are doing it because they have run out of ways to stay alive? The surviving records suggest that theft, begging, vagrancy, and movement from place to place became more visible during the Great Famine. That makes sense. People with no grain, no animals left to sell, no wages and no relatives able to support them had to do something. They might beg at a monastery gate. They might travel to a town rumoured to have bread. They might take firewood, vegetables, fodder, grain, or livestock. They might leave the village entirely. But we need to be careful here. Medieval chroniclers loved stories of social collapse. They wrote about starving people, wandering roads, thieves attacking travellers, abandoned children, and communities descending into disorder. Some of those accounts may preserve real experiences. Hunger absolutely created desperation. But chroniclers also had reasons to emphasize horror. A dramatic famine looked like a warning from God. It proved the moral seriousness of the age. It made rulers who restored order seem more impressive. And, like writers in every century, chroniclers knew that catastrophe makes a powerful story. So we should not imagine every road in Europe filled with armed gangs, or every village dissolving into violence. The evidence is uneven. It is strongest where legal records, town accounts, monastic documents, and local complaints happen to survive. And those records tend to preserve trouble. Nobody writes down a court case because a hungry family quietly shared its last bowl of pottage with a neighbour. But if someone stole a horse, broke into a granary, or was arrested as a vagrant, that could enter the record. What we can say is that hunger put enormous strain on the rules that normally held communities together. Picture a small village in a better year. Most people are not rich. Far from it. But they know one another. They know whose field lies beside whose. They know who has a few chickens, who owns an ox, who can lend seed, who has kin in the next settlement, and who is already poor enough to need help. There are customs about grazing animals, gathering wood, using common land, borrowing tools, and helping at harvest. Now remove the harvest. The common pasture has less fodder. The Lord's grain store is guarded more closely. The wealthier household has food, but not enough to feed everyone asking at its door. A widow has nothing left to sell. A labourer cannot find work because farmers have no surplus to pay wages. Someone begins taking from the edges of another family's land. Someone else accuses them of theft. A disagreement that might once have been settled with a fine, an apology, or a village elder now carries the weight of hunger. That is how famine can turn ordinary friction into conflict. Authorities often responded by tightening control. Towns regulated the bread trade, watched market prices, inspected weights, and tried to stop bakers or merchants from cheating customers. Officials might restrict exports of grain, discourage hoarding, or attempt to control who could buy and sell food. Lords and royal governments worried about theft, disorder, and people abandoning obligations on the land. Beggars and migrants, especially strangers, could be treated not only as people in need but as possible criminals, burdens, or threats. This was not simply cruelty, though it could be cruel in practice. Authorities faced a nightmare of their own. If grain was allowed to flow out of a hungry town, local people might starve sooner. If merchants were free to charge whatever desperate buyers would pay, bread could become unreachable. If crowds gathered around storehouses or markets, officials feared panic, looting, and violence. They believed order itself was a form of survival. But order usually protected property first. A wealthy merchant with grain stored for sale had options a landless labourer did not. A noble household might reduce expenses, draw on rents, borrow money, or obtain supplies through networks stretching across several estates. A monastery might sell valuables or shift food from one manor to another. None of these protections made the elite immune. Some lords and institutions suffered serious financial damage. But famine did not strike every stomach equally. The poorest had almost no buffer. They had little grain in reserve, few possessions to pawn, and limited access to credit. Their work often depended on other people having enough surplus to hire them. When prices rose, they were hit twice. Food cost more, and opportunities to earn money could disappear. Children, the elderly, the sick, widows, servants, and people without secure land were especially exposed. This is one of the hardest truths about the Great Famine. It was not a single disaster experienced in the same way by everyone under the reign. For one household, it meant eating less meat and selling a few belongings. For another, it meant consuming seed grain needed for next year's planting. For another, it meant losing an animal, then losing the ability to plough, then falling into debt, then leaving home. For some, it meant death, and leaving home could be its own kind of catastrophe. Families separated. A parent might send a child to relatives, a religious house, or a household that still had food. Young men might leave in search of work. Women might travel to towns to beg or find service. Entire households could be pushed off marginal land after they could no longer pay rents or meet obligations. We cannot always trace these individual stories clearly. The people most likely to disappear were often the people least likely to leave records. But the broad pattern is visible. Famine made people move, and movement weakened the local networks that had once helped them survive. Communities were strained not only by crime, but by impossible choices. Who receives the last bread? The family member? The neighbour? The tenant who owes rent? The stranger at the gate? The child who is sickest, or the child most likely to live? These are not questions any social order handles well. And as hunger dragged on, rulers and local authorities could no longer treat the crisis as a problem of individual bad behaviour. A thief could be punished, a beggar could be driven away. A market could be regulated, but none of that produced a harvest. Soon, kings, lords and governments would have to confront a far more unsettling reality. The famine was larger than local charity, larger than village discipline, and larger than the old tools of authority. The old tools of authority were not designed for a crisis like this. A medieval king could command armies. He could issue laws. He could summon nobles, collect taxes, punish offenders, and demand grain for his household. A lord could order his tenants to work, enforce local custom, and open or close access to his stores. Town governments could inspect bread, regulate markets, and fine dishonest bakers, but none of them could command the rain to stop, and none of them possessed anything like a modern emergency system. There was no national food agency, no railway network carrying grain across a continent in days, no refrigerated storage, no accurate census of every hungry household, no central warehouse filled with reserves calculated to last through a failed harvest. Food was produced locally, stored locally, sold locally, and consumed locally. When a region failed, the people in that region had to find grain somewhere else. But in 1315, and then again in the years that followed, much of northern Europe was searching at the same time. That is what made this famine so difficult to govern. Rulers did act. They were not simply sitting in castles while everyone else starved. Royal governments, cities, bishops and lords tried many of the measures that would seem obvious in a shortage. They restricted grain exports. They attempted to limit prices. They regulated bakers and millers. They inspected weights and measures. They punished people accused of hoarding grain or selling it at what authorities considered excessive prices. Some towns tried to control the movement of food beyond their walls. Some institutions opened stores, distributed alms, or bought grain wherever they could find it. On paper, these measures made sense. If grain is scarce, do not let it leave the area. If merchants are charging desperate prices, stop them. If bakers are making loaves smaller, punish them. If wealthy households have supplies hidden away, force them into the market. Picture the logic. A town hears that carts carrying grain are headed toward another region. Its own market is thin. Bread prices are rising by the week. Local officials fear that a few merchants will make fortunes while ordinary people go hungry. So they issue an order. No grain leaves town without permission. Any dealer who ignores the rule faces fines, confiscation, perhaps worse. For the people inside the town, this could look like protection. But there was a problem. Every neighbouring town was thinking exactly the same way. Export bans can keep food from leaving one hungry place. They can also keep food from arriving in another. A merchant who risks having his grain confiscated, or being forced to sell at a low official price, may decide not to bring it to market at all. He may hide it, he may wait, he may sell through private networks to customers with influence and money. Or he may simply take his business somewhere authorities are less able to interfere. The medieval world understood this problem in practice, even if it did not use modern economic language. Officials wanted cheap bread, but they also needed merchants to keep bringing grain. They wanted to stop hoarding, but they could not always tell the difference between a merchant holding supplies for future sale and a household trying to survive the winter. They wanted to prevent panic, but every new regulation could create new incentives to evade it, and enforcement was painfully limited. A king's decree was only as powerful as the people carrying it out. Orders had to travel by messenger. Sheriffs, bailiffs, reeves, town officers, and local lords had to interpret them. Markets had to be inspected. Carts had to be stopped. Granaries had to be searched. Fines had to be collected. In a society of muddy roads, scattered villages, private jurisdictions, and local privileges, that was enormously difficult even in a normal year. During famine, it became harder still. The officials doing the enforcing were hungry too. The villagers asked to report hidden grain might depend on the very people they were reporting. A local lord might protect his own tenants while ignoring royal instructions. A merchant with friends in the town council could receive treatment that a poor peddler did not. And a powerful monastery, noble household, or bishopric might have stores and legal privileges beyond the reach of ordinary town officers. This was not one government acting on one population. It was a patchwork of kings, princes, bishops, abbots, nobles, cities, guilds, manors, and villages. Their authority overlapped, their interests collided. And when grain became scarce, each institution had strong reasons to protect its own people first. Then there was war. The early 14th century was not peaceful before the famine arrived, and hunger did not persuade rulers to stop fighting. England was deeply involved in conflict with Scotland. Armies required food, horses, transport, and money. Royal officials could seize supplies through purveyance, taking grain, animals, carts, and other goods for the crown, sometimes promising payment later. In theory, this helped sustain the kingdom's defence. In practice, people already facing scarcity could see their remaining resources carried away for war. Taxation created another pressure point. A ruler facing military expenses still needed revenue. Lords still expected rents. Towns still had debts, obligations, and defensive costs. But famine shrank the very economy being taxed. Peasants with no surplus could not easily pay. Traders had less business. Landlords saw tenants fail, flee, or fall behind. Governments needed more resources precisely when their subjects had the least ability to provide them. And political rivalries could turn relief into another weapon. Grain was not just food, it was power. Whoever controlled a port, a river crossing, a market, or a storehouse controlled a chance of survival. A ruler might favour a loyal city, a town might protect its own citizens before feeding outsiders. Local elites could secure supplies through connections unavailable to the poor. Even charitable institutions had limits. A monastery's grain reserve might feed many people for a time, but it could not feed an entire countryside through repeated failed harvests. So could government action have reduced the suffering? Almost certainly at the margins. Fairer market rules, better protection against fraud, emergency distributions, reduced taxes, restraints on requisitioning, and efforts to keep trade routes open could save lives. A town granary opened at the right moment could mean the difference between survival and death for hundreds of households. A lord who delayed rents, released seed grain, or allowed access to common resources could keep tenants from collapse. A ruler who recognized that hungry people needed food more than punishment could prevent desperation from becoming disaster. But no decree could create grain that had never ripened. That was the brutal limit. Medieval governments could redistribute scarcity. They could sometimes soften it. They could also make it worse. But they could not solve a continent-wide food crisis with institutions built for a far smaller world. And nowhere would that weakness become clearer than in England, where a king already burdened by war and political conflict faced a kingdom sinking deeper into mud, shortage, and prices that seemed to rise without end. England is one of the places where we can watch the famine happening almost week by week. Not because England suffered more than every other part of Europe. It did not, and not because English people had some special protection against hunger. They absolutely did not, but England left records. Manorial accounts, royal financial rolls, monastic chronicles, court cases, estate surveys, grain purchases recorded by stewards who needed to explain every penny. These documents do not give us the voice of every starving family. Poor people rarely left written testimony, but they show the machinery around them beginning to strain. They show harvests failing, prices climbing, animals dying, rents going unpaid, and officials trying to make a kingdom function when the food system underneath it was breaking down. And the picture they give is grim. The rains of 1315 did not just make England unpleasant. They turned the countryside into a trap. Fields could not be worked properly. Seed went into cold, saturated soil and failed to establish itself. Hay could not be cut and dried when it needed to be. Carts sank into roads, rivers flooded low ground. Grain that should have been ripening stood damp in the fields, vulnerable to rot before it ever reached a barn. Then came the harvest, or rather, the thing that passed for a harvest. In many places, yields were disastrously low. The grain that did come in was often poor quality, damp, spoiled, light, or damaged. And when supplies became scarce, the price of food began moving in a way that frightened everyone who depended on the market. A normal quarter of wheat in England might sell for around 5 shillings in a reasonably good year. During the famine, prices in some markets rose to 3, 4, even close to 5 times that level. In 1316, the crisis year after the first failed harvest, wheat prices reached levels that would have been almost unimaginable only a few years earlier. Think about what that meant in practice. For a wealthy lord, high prices were painful. For a monastery, they forced difficult choices. For a town government, they created panic. But for a labourer paid by the day, or a tenant family with little grain left after rent, seed, and household needs, a doubling of bread prices could be catastrophic. A wage that had bought enough grain for a family last year might now buy only part of what it had bought before, and wages did not instantly rise to meet the cost. They rarely do in a crisis. Food becomes expensive first. The poor become hungry first, and by the time employers adjust, if they adjust at all, the damage has already been done. Manorial records reveal this pressure from another angle. England was covered by estates run for lords, bishops, monasteries and colleges. Their stewards kept accounts because estates were businesses as well as communities. They tracked seed, harvests, livestock, rents, labour services, sales and purchases. When the weather turned bad, those accounts started recording an economy in distress. Less grain came from the fields. More grain had to be bought at inflated prices. Tenants fell behind on obligations. Some could not pay rents. Some could not provide the labour services they owed. Others may have sold animals, tools, or stored goods just to survive until the next season. And that next season failed too. This is the part that made the Great Famine more than a single bad harvest. A household might endure one terrible year by eating reserves, selling a cow, borrowing from neighbours, reducing meals, or consuming the seed grain meant for spring planting. But those were survival strategies with a price. Once the reserves were gone, once the animals were sold, once the seed was eaten, recovery became much harder. The land itself was also losing productive power. Livestock suffered in the wet conditions. Cattle and sheep needed fodder, but hay was difficult to make and preserve. Pastures were waterlogged. Disease spread more easily among weakened animals. There is evidence from English estates of severe livestock losses during these years, especially among sheep and cattle. This mattered for more than meat. Animals provided milk, wool, manure, traction, and future breeding stock. Lose the oxen, and ploughing next year becomes harder. Lose the sheep, and a major source of income disappears. Lose the dairy animals, and one of the few reliable foods for children vanishes with them. Even the royal government could not escape the crisis. Edward II was already fighting in Scotland, and war required grain, horses, carts, and cash. Royal officials continued to rely on purveyance, the Crown's power to take supplies for military needs, often with payment promised later. In a normal year, that system caused resentment. In a famine, it could feel like disaster arriving with an official seal. The Crown issued orders about grain, markets, and supplies. It worried about scarcity in London and other major centres. It tried to procure food for its household and armies. But every royal purchase entered the same desperate market as everyone else. Every cart of grain sent north for war was grain, not available to a hungry village or town. Still, England was not one uniform landscape of suffering. The wettest areas faced one set of problems. Low-lying lands and heavy clay soils could become nearly impossible to cultivate. Pastoral regions faced fodder shortages and animal disease. Grain-growing counties in the east and southeast could be badly hit by failed crops, but their access to rivers, ports, and larger markets sometimes gave them options unavailable to isolated upland communities. London, for all its dependence on imported food, had wealth, political importance, and access to shipping. It could draw grain toward itself from coastal trade networks when supplies existed to be drawn. A remote village in the north or west had fewer choices. Northern England also lived under the shadow of the Scottish War, raids, military demands, and disrupted movement. For those communities, famine was not arriving alone. And that is why England's records must be handled carefully. They are extraordinarily valuable because they are so numerous. A monastery's account book can show us the exact price it paid for grain. A manor roll can reveal a tenant unable to meet obligations. A royal writ can show government fear spreading through the system. But surviving records often come from institutions with property, literacy, and administrators. They show the view from the estate office, the abbey, the sheriff's desk, and the royal chancery. They do not automatically tell us that every English village suffered in exactly the same way, and England itself does not automatically stand in for all of Europe. What it does show with unusual clarity is the mechanism of famine. Too much rain, repeated harvest failure, shrinking reserves, rising prices, weakening bodies, dead livestock, debts that could not be paid. Government demands that did not disappear simply because people were hungry. A kingdom of muddy roads and flooded fields was discovering that money, law, and royal authority meant very little when the grain would not grow. Across the Channel, in some of Europe's most crowded and commercially connected regions, the same disaster was taking on an even more dangerous form. Across the Channel, the famine entered a region that looked, at first glance, better equipped to survive it. Northern France and the Low Countries were among the most densely settled, commercially active parts of medieval Europe. This was a world of market towns, river traffic, cloth workshops, ports, toll stations, monasteries, fortified cities, and fields cultivated so intensely that there was often very little margin for failure. And in 1315, that margin disappeared. The rains that battered England did not stop at the coast. Northern France faced the same cold, wet pattern: sodden ground, delayed planting, damaged grain and harvests that failed to meet the needs of a large population. In regions from Normandy and Picardy to Artois and Flanders, the problem was not simply that some farmers had a bad year. The problem was that millions of people were tied into a food system already running close to its limits. These were productive lands. In a good year, they could support crowded villages, powerful towns, armies, monasteries, noble households, and industries that depended on workers being fed. But intensive agriculture has a weakness. It can produce a great deal when conditions cooperate. When they do not, there may be no empty land, no vast reserve pastures, no hidden surplus waiting to save everyone. A bad harvest in a sparsely settled region is a local emergency. A bad harvest in one of Europe's densest corridors becomes something much larger. Northern France had also been under pressure long before the famine began. The kingdom was wealthy by medieval standards, but wealth was not the same thing as security. Decades of war, taxation, royal administration, and political conflict had imposed heavy demands on communities. The French crown had been fighting with Flanders for influence over a region that was economically vital and politically difficult to control. Lords had obligations. Towns had taxes. Peasants had rents, dues, labour services, and church payments. Then the rain came, and none of those obligations simply vanished. Imagine a peasant household in Picardy. The field is too wet to work when it should be worked. The grain comes up poorly, if it comes up at all. The harvest is light. What remains must be divided between food for the family, seed for the next year, rent for the lord, dues for the church, and whatever debts are already hanging over the household. There is no good choice here. Eat the seed, and next year may fail before it begins. Pay the rent, and children may go hungry. Sell an animal, and there is less milk, less manure, less power to work the land. That was the arithmetic of famine, and it was merciless. The Low Countries faced an even more complicated version of the same problem. Parts of modern Belgium and the Netherlands were extraordinarily urbanized for the 14th century. Cities such as Bruges, Ghent, Ypres and others had populations sustained not just by nearby farms, but by trade. Flanders was famous for cloth. Its towns turned English wool into textiles, sold across Europe. Merchants moved goods through the North Sea, along the Scheldt and Meuse rivers, through canals, ports and market networks that connected village producers to distant consumers. Under normal conditions, this was a strength. A city with access to shipping could import grain. A merchant could buy food in one region and sell it where prices were highest. Rivers could move bulky cargo more efficiently than roads. Ports could draw supplies from England, France, the Rhineland or the Baltic. Commerce gave urban communities options that an isolated village did not have. But trade cannot create grain where grain does not exist. And when poor weather affected much of northern Europe at once, every port was looking for the same cargo. Every merchant was searching for the same scarce supplies. Every city government was trying to secure food before its rivals did. The river networks still mattered. Barges carrying grain could sometimes relieve immediate shortages in one town. Coastal shipping could shift supplies toward major ports. Wealthy cities could use credit, political influence and cash to buy what food remained on the market. But those advantages came with a darker side. The more purchasing power a city had, the more effectively it could pull grain away from poorer districts. A town might survive because villages around it went without. Urban chronicles from the region preserve flashes of this anxiety. They describe dear food, hardship, disorder, and the fear that came when bread became too expensive for ordinary workers. Chroniclers were not modern investigators. They often wrote from monasteries, councils, or wealthy households. They could exaggerate, moralize, or interpret disaster as divine punishment. But across these records, the pattern is unmistakable. Food scarcity was not a rumour. It was shaping daily life. Town governments responded because they had to. Officials tried to monitor markets, prevent grain from being exported, regulate bakers, control prices, and punish hoarding or speculation. Some cities purchased grain collectively. Some sought supplies through merchants, or ordered that food entering the town be sold locally. These measures could reduce panic at the edges. They could make sure that a shipment did not immediately disappear into private warehouses. They could protect privileged citizens, hospitals, religious houses, or municipal stores. But they could not command a harvest to ripen. Price controls were especially difficult. Set the legal price too low, and sellers might refuse to bring grain to market at all. Allow prices to rise freely, and the poor could be priced out of bread. Officials were trapped between two bad options: a market that was brutally expensive, or a market with nothing in it. And behind the food crisis stood the region's older political tensions. Flanders depended heavily on the English wool trade. France wanted influence over Flanders. Flemish towns guarded their privileges fiercely. Merchants, guilds, counts, bishops, kings, and urban governments all had competing interests, even in good times. Famine did not pause those rivalries, it made them sharper. When grain was scarce, a political boundary became a food boundary. A military dispute could interrupt movement. A toll could raise costs. An embargo could turn commercial dependence into danger. A ruler trying to secure supplies for soldiers or a royal household entered direct competition with hungry civilians. The Low Countries had rivers, ports, money, and some of the most sophisticated commercial networks in Europe. Northern France had fertile land, major towns, and the resources of a powerful monarchy. Yet all of that complexity rested on a simple foundation. Fields had to produce food. When rain ruined the fields across an entire region, commerce could redistribute scarcity. It could not defeat it, and the crisis did not end at the borders of France or the trading cities of Flanders. Pull back the map, and the pattern becomes even more disturbing. Across the German lands, through the Rhine Valley along the Baltic coast, into Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Scotland, Ireland, and parts of Eastern Europe, communities were confronting versions of the same nightmare. Rain, cold, damaged crops, rising prices, hungry animals, hungry people. But this was not one perfectly uniform disaster, moving across Europe like a single black cloud. The Great Famine was broad. It was northern European. But it was also intensely local. One valley might lose its grain to flooding, while a neighbouring district suffered mainly from a late harvest. One town might receive a shipment by river just before prices exploded. Another, only a few days away by road, might be cut off by mud, damaged bridges, or a lord demanding tolls. A region with poor harvests could sometimes buy food from elsewhere. A region with money but no transport could still starve. That is one of the hardest things to understand about medieval famine. Hunger was never distributed fairly. It followed rainfall, soil, harvest dates, roads, rivers, markets, political boundaries, and simple luck. In the German-speaking lands, the situation was especially varied because there was no single German kingdom with one government, one grain policy, or one set of records. The Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of duchies, bishoprics, free cities, monasteries, counties, and lordships. A traveller could cross several jurisdictions in a day. Every one of them had different laws, different local authorities, and different abilities to respond when food grew scarce. The Rhineland had major rivers and busy towns. In theory, that created options. Grain could move on the Rhine far more easily than it could move over a road turned to mud. Cities with merchants, warehouses, and access to credit were often better positioned than isolated upland villages. Some could seek supplies from less damaged districts. Some could draw on ecclesiastical reserves. Some could regulate markets, at least for a time. But again, the same problem returned. If every town on the river was trying to buy grain, the river did not solve the shortage. It became a route along which scarcity travelled. Further north, the Baltic world had certain advantages. Ports connected the coast of northern Germany, Denmark, Scandinavia, and the eastern Baltic. Trading networks could move rye, fish, salt, timber, and other necessities across long distances. Areas with lower population pressure, more pasture, more fishing, or access to maritime trade may have endured the crisis better than the crowded grain-dependent regions of England, Flanders, and northern France. Better, however, did not mean safe. Scandinavia was already a difficult environment in which to farm. Growing seasons were shorter. Weather mattered more. A cold, wet summer that might reduce yields in a southern region could become devastating where grain had little time to ripen, even in a good year. Norway, in particular, depended on a fragile mixture of farming, livestock, fishing, and trade. Mountainous terrain and scattered settlements made transport difficult. Communities along the coast could sometimes rely on fish. Inland communities had fewer options. And famine in Scandinavia did not always look exactly like famine in England. A chronicler in an English monastery might write about bread prices, grain shortages, and the desperate poor at the gate. A Norwegian source might preserve the crisis differently, through royal records, church accounts, laws, or later narratives. In some regions, the documentary trail is thin. In others, it is rich but biased toward bishops, kings, merchants, or urban elites. This matters because historians are not comparing identical reports. They are comparing fragments. One source counts deaths in a monastery. Another complains about the price of rye. Another records tax failures because peasants could not pay. Another mentions wolves approaching settlements, abandoned farms, or ships sent to seek grain. Another says almost nothing at all, not because nothing happened, but because no one left a surviving record. Silence is not proof of safety, but neither is a dramatic chronicle proof that every person in a region suffered in exactly the same way. Ireland and Scotland show why this wider map has to be handled carefully. Both were tied to the Northern Atlantic weather system. Both could be battered by excessive rain, failed grain, livestock losses, and disrupted movement. Scotland's colder climate and difficult terrain left many communities exposed when harvests went wrong. In the Highlands and Islands, people had different food resources from those in the lowlands: cattle, oats, fish, and local systems of exchange. That diversity could offer some protection, but it could also mean that one failed resource pushed pressure onto all the others. Ireland had fertile areas and important pastoral economies, but it was not insulated from the wider crisis. Wet weather could damage grain and fodder, while political conflict and uneven control by English authorities complicated relief and trade. A lordship at war, a port disrupted by violence, or a local elite protecting its own stores could turn a poor harvest into a deadly shortage. The key point is this: the Great Famine was not a single number of dead, a single harvest failure, or a single experience repeated from London to Dublin to Stockholm. It was a connected crisis, unfolding across many different societies. The rains and cold created the pressure, but local conditions decided how that pressure was felt. A port city with access to shipping might find grain. A fishing community might survive on the sea when fields failed. A lightly populated region with more land per person might have a little more room to absorb a bad year. A monastery with stored food could feed some dependents. A wealthy town could outbid poorer neighbours for a while. But the longer the bad weather continued, the fewer these advantages mattered. Trade networks were strongest when there was surplus somewhere to trade. Local reserves helped only until they were eaten. Lower population pressure bought time, not immunity. And by 1316, time was exactly what Northern Europe was running out of. By 1316, time was exactly what Northern Europe was running out of. The first failed harvest had been a disaster. The second was something worse. Because a medieval farming household could survive one bad year sometimes. It could eat stored grain, sell a few animals, borrow from a neighbour, delay a payment, gather nuts, fish, roots, wild plants, anything that might stretch the food supply until the next harvest. But that only worked if there was a next harvest worth waiting for. And in 1316, across much of northern Europe, the weather did not offer one. The rains returned. Conditions remained cold and wet in many places. Fields that had already been damaged in 1315 were planted late, if they were planted at all. Grain struggled again. Haymaking suffered again. Roads became difficult again. Rivers rose again. The crisis that had begun as a terrible season was turning into a system-wide collapse. Think about the trap farmers were caught in. To grow food next year, you need seed this year. But seed grain is still grain. It is edible. It is sitting in a household while children are hungry and prices are rising every week. Every family faced the same impossible calculation. Eat the seed and risk next year. Preserve the seed and risk starving now. Some households held back what they could. Others had no choice. They ate it. That decision was not foolishness. It was desperation. You cannot ask a starving family to sacrifice the present for a harvest they may never live to see. And even families who saved seed faced another problem. Seed does not guarantee a crop. It has to be sown into workable ground. It needs enough dry weather for ploughing, planting, weeding and harvesting. It needs animals strong enough to pull a plough. It needs people healthy enough to do the labour. By 1316, all of those things were becoming scarce. The animals were dying too. Horses, oxen, cattle, sheep and pigs had already suffered from poor fodder and disease. Wet meadows produced less usable hay. Grain that might have fed livestock was being kept for people if there was any grain to keep. Animals weakened through winter. Some were slaughtered early because families needed meat. Others died because there was simply nothing left to feed them. And this created another vicious circle. Lose a pig, and you lose food. Lose sheep, and you lose wool, milk, manure, and future lambs. Lose cattle, and you lose dairy products and breeding stock. Lose an ox or horse, and you may lose the ability to plough at all. A household without draft animals could not simply work harder. Medieval agriculture depended on animal power. Heavy soils needed ploughs. Ploughs needed teams. A farmer who had lost his oxen might have to rent animals, borrow them, pay labourers, or leave part of the land unplanted. In a normal year, that was a hardship. In 1316, it could be the difference between recovery and ruin. Then there was debt. At the beginning of the famine, borrowing could keep a family alive. A peasant might borrow grain from a lord, a monastery, a merchant, or a better-off neighbour. An urban household might pawn clothing, tools, furniture, or even rights to future wages. A village might take on obligations it expected to repay after the next harvest. But when the next harvest failed too, debt stopped being a bridge to safety. It became a weight dragging people under. Interest accumulated. Rents still came due. Taxes and feudal obligations did not disappear simply because the rain had ruined the fields. Some landlords reduced demands, delayed payments, or distributed aid. Others could not afford to be generous because their own estates were losing income. And some protected their revenue as fiercely as possible, trying to squeeze payment from people who had already sold everything they could sell. This is why famine lasted longer than bad weather alone. The rain damaged the harvest, but hunger then damaged the ability to produce the next one. Weak people could not work as effectively. Sick people could not work at all. Families broke apart as servants left, labourers wandered in search of food, and children were sent away if another household might feed them. Fields went untilled. Ditches and drainage systems were neglected. Buildings, tools, carts and fences fell into disrepair. A village did not have to vanish completely to become less able to feed itself. It only had to lose enough animals, enough seed, enough labour, enough health, and enough hope. By 1317, the situation was beginning to change in some regions. That word matters, some. Weather conditions gradually became less relentless. Harvests improved unevenly. Grain began to appear in markets with a little more regularity. Prices in certain places started to ease from their most extreme levels. For people who had survived with land, seed, animals, and some remaining credit, this was the beginning of recovery. But recovery did not mean abundance. A better harvest after two terrible ones first had to refill empty granaries. It had to provide seed for the next planting. It had to replace animals that had been killed or had died. It had to pay accumulated debts. It had to feed people whose bodies had been weakened for years. And many of those people were no longer there. Some had died. Some had abandoned their homes. Some had lost their land to debt. Some were alive, but had no ox, no plough, no seed, no savings, and no one willing to lend to them again. The wealthy recovered first, usually. A lord with multiple estates could shift resources. A monastery with surviving rents and stores could rebuild its herds. A merchant with capital could buy when prices finally fell. A town with trade connections could restock its markets. A small tenant who had eaten his seed grain and sold his animals did not recover at the same speed. Nor did a widow with children, nor a landless labourer whose wages bought less food than before, nor a village in a remote upland district where transport remained poor and the soil had been exhausted. For them, the famine could continue long after chroniclers stopped describing rain every day. That is the terrible logic of a multi-year disaster. The weather may begin to improve before society does. By the later 1310s, Europe was slowly crawling away from the edge. But it emerged poorer, weaker, more indebted, and more vulnerable than it had been in 1315. The fields could grow again. The markets could fill again. Yet the missing people, the dead animals, the lost seed, and the years of hunger had left a wound that would not close quickly. And that raises the question historians have argued over ever since. How many people did this catastrophe actually kill? The honest answer is that nobody knows exactly, not because the famine was too small to notice. It was one of the greatest disasters medieval Europe had ever experienced. Chroniclers saw it, priests saw it, lords collecting rents saw it, villages burying their dead saw it. But medieval Europe did not conduct modern censuses. Nobody went from house to house in 1314, counted every person, then returned in 1318 and counted who was missing. So when you hear a number like 10%, 15%, even 25% of the population, it is important to understand what that number really is. It is not a body count, it is an estimate, a reconstruction. Historians taking fragments of evidence from a broken world and trying to work out how much broke. Some modern estimates suggest that the Great Famine may have killed around 10 to 15% of the population in the regions most deeply affected. Others allow for higher losses in particular places, perhaps much higher. You will sometimes see claims that a quarter of the population died. That is possible in some local communities during the worst years. But as a total for all of Northern Europe, it is much harder to prove. And that distinction matters. Europe was not one uniform landscape. It was thousands of villages, towns, manors, monasteries, river valleys, ports, uplands, and farming districts. A coastal town with access to fish and ships might suffer terribly, but survive better than an isolated inland village. A lord with large grain stores might protect some tenants. A community hit by hunger, livestock disease, and epidemic illness all at once might collapse far more severely. The famine did not kill evenly, it moved through a world already divided by wealth, geography, and power. So how do historians even begin to measure it? One source is the Chronicle. Medieval writers recorded horrifying scenes, people dying beside roads, parents unable to feed children, starving travellers, abandoned bodies, fields left uncultivated. Some claimed that the dead were too numerous to bury properly. Others described famines so severe that it seemed to overturn the normal order of the world. These accounts are invaluable. They tell us that contemporaries recognized an extraordinary catastrophe. They preserve fear, shock, and the feeling that society itself was coming apart. But chronicles have limits. Many were written by monks, clerics, or educated urban observers. They were often far from the worst-hit villages. Some relied on rumour, some used biblical language to describe suffering, and medieval writers were not trying to calculate national mortality rates. They were trying to explain what the disaster meant. Was this divine punishment, a warning, a test, a sign that rulers had failed. A chronicler may tell us that countless people died. That can be emotionally true without being statistically precise. Then there are burial records and archaeological sites. In theory, graves should give us a direct answer. More deaths should mean more burials. But here too, the evidence is frustrating. Most ordinary medieval people were buried in churchyards that had been reused, disturbed, built over, or never excavated. Skeletons do not come with labels saying, "Died of famine, winter of 1316, and starvation itself often leaves no single unmistakable mark on bone. People weakened by hunger frequently died from infections, exposure, diarrhea, respiratory disease, or illnesses that a well-fed body might have survived. Famine often kills indirectly. It makes every ordinary danger more deadly. A child with too little food becomes vulnerable to disease. An elderly person loses strength. A labourer cannot recover from injury. A pregnant woman faces greater risk. A minor infection becomes fatal because the body has nothing left to fight with. So even if we could identify every grave from these years, we would still face the same question. Did this person die of hunger itself, or of the illness that hunger made lethal? Manorial records can sometimes get us closer. On a medieval manor, officials kept track of rents, inheritances, land transfers, labour services and fines paid when tenants died. If a tenant holding suddenly passed from one family member to another, that may reveal a death. If many holdings stood empty, if rent stopped arriving, if widows appeared in unusual numbers, if land was left without an heir, historians can see the pressure building. In some English records, the years of famine show exactly this kind of disruption. More deaths, more abandoned holdings, more land changing hands. More signs that households were struggling to remain intact. But a manor is not a kingdom. It may be unusually well documented because its lord preserved good records. Or unusually badly hit because local soils were poor. It may lose tenants not because they died, but because they fled, married elsewhere, entered service, or simply disappeared from the record. A vacant plot can mean death. It can also mean migration. And migration during famine was enormous, even if it is difficult to trace. People left villages looking for food, work, charity, or relatives who might take them in. Some went to towns, some moved between estates, some crossed borders. Some became servants, beggars, or wandering labourers. A family vanishing from one record does not always mean it vanished from the world. This is why historians use demographic reconstruction. They compare many kinds of evidence at once: manorial records, tax lists, grain prices, inheritance patterns, monastery accounts, urban registers, and later population trends. They look for a pattern that no single source can reveal alone. And what emerges is clear, even if the exact number remains uncertain. The Great Famine caused a major demographic shock across much of Northern Europe, but deaths were only part of that shock. Hunger also meant fewer births. Couples delayed marriage because they could not afford a household. Malnutrition reduced fertility. Pregnancies became more dangerous. Infants and young children, already the most vulnerable members of medieval society, faced the harshest odds of all. That means population decline can be larger than the number of famine deaths alone. Imagine a village of 100 people. Perhaps 10 die during the worst years. But perhaps several children who would normally have been born are never born. Perhaps 2 families leave. Perhaps survivors are weakened for years, less able to work, marry, and raise children. The village may take decades to regain its former numbers, even after the rain has stopped, and the health effects could travel through generations. Children who survived prolonged hunger often grew up smaller, weaker, and more vulnerable to later disease. Livestock herds took years to rebuild. Farms remained underused. Debt endured. A famine is not just an event measured in graves. It is a loss of strength, labour, children, animals, confidence, and future possibilities. So careful history does not give us a comforting exact figure. It gives us something more unsettling. Across the hardest hit parts of Europe, perhaps 1 person in 10 died. Perhaps more in some regions, perhaps less in others. We cannot turn uncertainty into certainty just because a clean number feels satisfying. But we do not need a perfect count to understand the scale of what happened. Millions of people may have lived through years in which food became uncertain, bodies weakened, families scattered, and death moved closer with every failed harvest. Europe survived the Great Famine, but it did not emerge unchanged, and less than 3 decades later, a new catastrophe would find that wounded Europe waiting. That wounded Europe is the key. The Great Famine did not simply end when harvests improved. A better year could fill a few granaries. It could not instantly replace the people who had died, the children who had never been born, the animals that had perished, or the savings that poor households had consumed one desperate meal at a time. For years afterward, Europe carried the damage. A peasant family that had sold its tools, seed grain or livestock to survive now faced the next planting season with less ability to plant. A household that had borrowed heavily at high prices could remain trapped by debt long after bread became cheaper. A manor that had lost tenants, lost rents and labour, a town whose poor had been reduced to begging had to confront the cost of feeding, policing, and burying people who had once supported themselves. Recovery was not a switch being turned back on. It was more like trying to rebuild a house while still standing in the rain. And the famine exposed a weakness at the centre of medieval Europe's success. Before 1315, population had grown for generations. Forests had been cleared, wetlands drained, marginal soils brought under cultivation. More land meant more food, at least for a while. Villages expanded into uplands, heavy clay districts and other places that could produce grain in decent years, but offered little safety when the weather turned bad. Europe had become more productive, but it had also become more tightly stretched. In many regions, there was simply not much reserve left. Most people lived close to subsistence. They ate what their fields produced, paid rents and dues from what remained, and depended on the next harvest arriving more or less on time. Granaries existed, markets existed, long-distance trade existed, but none of them could fully protect a densely populated continent when bad weather struck wide areas at once for several consecutive years. That is what made the rains so devastating. The problem was never rain by itself. Europe had always known wet springs, harsh winters, poor harvests, and local shortages. The problem was a farming system built around narrow margins, meeting an environmental shock that lasted too long, spread too widely, and damaged nearly every part of food production at once. Grain rotted, seed failed, hay could not be gathered, livestock weakened, transport broke down in mud and floodwater, prices rose just as wages and household reserves disappeared. A society can survive one bad harvest. It can sometimes survive 2. But 3 years of failure revealed how little room there was between ordinary life and catastrophe. The demographic effects lasted as well. Survivors did not emerge healthy simply because they had survived. Children born during the famine years may have faced the effects of malnutrition for the rest of their lives. Families delayed marriage. Birth rates fell. Some villages lost households that were never replaced. In the most damaged areas, land could lie underused because there were too few people, too few animals, or too little capital to work it properly. That did not mean Europe suddenly became empty. It did mean that growth stalled, and in some places reversed. And the social consequences were harder to measure, but impossible to ignore. The famine changed what people expected from authority. Medieval rulers could not control the weather. Nobody expected a king to command the clouds to part. But people did expect lords, bishops, town governments, and kings to do something when food disappeared. Open grain stores, restrict exports, punish hoarding, organize charity, keep roads safe, prevent merchants from exploiting hunger. Sometimes authorities acted. Sometimes they failed. Often their resources were simply too limited for the scale of the emergency. But the expectation remained. If order was supposed to protect society, what did it mean when people starved in a land of churches, castles, markets and laws? That question would not vanish when the fields turned green again. It may have encouraged some towns to strengthen grain regulation and poor relief. It may have pushed rulers toward more active intervention in food markets. Lords had to reckon with vacant holdings, reduced rents, and tenants too weak or too poor to meet old obligations. In some areas, land use may have shifted slowly away from the most vulnerable grain production toward pasture, livestock, or more varied farming. But change was uneven. Medieval Europe was not remade overnight by one crisis. Old institutions survived because they were flexible enough to survive, or powerful enough to impose themselves again. Still, confidence had been damaged. Then came the wider disasters of the 14th century. Wars intensified in some regions, political conflict disrupted trade and burned fields. Later, in the 1340s, the Black Death would arrive and kill on a scale that made the famine seem like a grim warning of what was possible. It would be too simple to say the Great Famine caused those later catastrophes. It did not cause plague bacteria to reach Europe. It did not create every war or rebellion that followed. But it mattered. It left people poorer, weaker, indebted, and less secure. It showed that the systems sustaining Europe's great medieval expansion were not invincible. And it taught a generation that prosperity could dissolve with terrifying speed. That is the long shadow of 1315. Not just the dead, though they were many. Not just the ruined harvests, though they changed everything. It was the knowledge that civilization rested on conditions nobody could guarantee. Workable soil, healthy animals, functioning roads, stored grain, social cooperation, and weather that behaved within familiar limits. When those conditions failed, hunger turned a natural shock into a human disaster. And eventually, after years of mud, rot, shortage and fear, the rain would finally begin to ease. And when the rain finally began to ease, Europe did not wake up healed by 1317. And in many places more clearly after that, harvest conditions started to improve. Fields that had been drowned, delayed and beaten flat by endless storms could finally produce something close to a usable crop. Grain moved again. Prices, though still painfully high in some regions, began to fall. The immediate terror of finding nothing to eat began to loosen its grip. But imagine what recovery meant to someone who had spent 2 or 3 years consuming every reserve they had. The seed grain was gone, the animals were gone, the tools had been sold, debts remained, parents had buried children, children had buried parents. A better harvest could fill a bowl. It could not restore the people missing from the table. That is why the Great Famine matters. It was not simply a story about bad weather. The rain began the crisis, but farming systems vulnerable to wet years turned rain into crop failure. Fragile markets turned crop failure into exploding prices. Unequal wealth meant some households could buy survival while others had nothing left to sell. Power determined whose grain was protected, whose debts were collected, whose hunger was noticed, and whose suffering disappeared from the record. And the records are incomplete. Medieval chroniclers wrote of terrible hunger, abandoned children, disease, theft, and death. Manorial accounts show falling yields and rising prices, but no one counted every grave. Historians still debate how many died, and mortality varied enormously from place to place. What cannot be doubted is the scale of the wound. For years across much of northern Europe, ordinary people discovered how thin the line was between a harvest and a catastrophe. So ask yourself, how secure is any society when its food system fails? When transport breaks down, prices surge, reserves vanish, and the people with the least power are expected to endure the most. The rain stopped. Eventually the grain grew again. But Europe remembered. If this story stayed with you, please like, comment and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from. And if you want to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify through the link in the description.